1944. World War II was reaching its dramatic climax.
Rocket ships firing, aircraft flying overhead.
As the Allies waged total war to liberate occupied Europe.
This was a war in which all sides were learning as they went.
From the beaches of Normandy,
the water was full of blood. The water was bright red.
To the forests of Germany.
Ich sehe dort heute noch die ganzen Toten liegen.
Both sides deployed weapons of ever greater power and sophistication.
And this tank suddenly gives the American a real big advantage. It's a very effective beast.
This is the story of the Western Allies' final campaign, told by the men on both sides who were there.
You did what you did. You fire and you maneuver.
He was my brother.
In September 1944, along the Dutch-Belgian border, the Allies began a desperate battle to clear well-entrenched German troops from a key strategic waterway.
The Germans had been there for 4 years. They knew the areas only like the back of their hand. And regardless of what you hear, they were very formidable.
Possession of the Scheldt Estuary was vital for the Allied advance into Germany. But German forces held both shores and would use every advantage offered by treacherous terrain.
Every time you made an advance, the Germans would blow the dikes and flood the land.
It was strewn with mines. Everywhere there was minefield.
The month-long, grueling campaign for this estuary would be Canada's bloodiest battle of World War II. This is the story of the Battle of the Scheldt. By September 1944, Hitler's Germany was staring defeat in the face. That summer, Stalin's Red Army had smashed through German forces on the Eastern Front and advanced as far as Poland and Romania. In the west, the Allies had liberated France and were closing in on the River Rhine and the German frontier. But then an Allied supply crisis brought the advance to a grinding halt.
The Allied industries back home in the United States and Britain were producing enormous amounts of supplies. Tens of thousands of tanks, millions of rounds of ammunition, and millions of gallons of fuel. The challenge was getting all of those supplies to their frontline troops.
The Allies had 5 armies in the field, 2.5 million men advancing on a broad front towards the Rhine. But their supplies still came from their Normandy beachhead, 300 miles to the rear. Frontline troops were no longer getting the fuel and ammunition they needed to continue the advance.
Modern warfare needs lots of petrol. Tanks gobble up petrol more than our cars do.
This is where there was this great argument about how the Allied forces should make their next move because they were running out of supplies.
Then, on the 4th of September, the British 11th Armoured Division captured the Belgian port of Antwerp. Crucially, with the help of the Belgian resistance, the British were able to capture the port intact before the Germans could sabotage it. At first glance, it seemed as if all the Allied supply issues would soon be at an end.
There are miles and miles and miles of docks there. Antwerp is the biggest, or was then the biggest harbour really in Europe. It was the biggest plum for the British Army.
We had Antwerp, and the harbour was intact. Still cranes and everything could be used. And most of the other places, like the other ports we took, the Germans had blown up the cranes and stuff, couldn't use the ports properly.
But there was one major problem. Antwerp is connected to the sea by a 45-mile-long estuary of the River Scheldt, which was still heavily mined and defended by the Germans. The Allies couldn't land supplies in Antwerp until the Scheldt had been cleared.
Once the Scheldt Estuary was cleared, the Allies could turn that into their main supply port, which would be sufficient to supply pretty much their entire war effort for the remaining campaign as they drove into Germany. And of course, the Germans knew that as well.
The Germans had built heavy coastal gun batteries on Walcheren Island, dominating the West Scheldt Estuary and making it impossible for Allied ships to reach Antwerp. The guns along the estuary were protected by thick concrete bunkers, almost impervious to air attack. They could only be taken by ground assault, across a landscape of rivers and open mudflats, with approaches covered by artillery and anti-tank guns, and beaches strewn with barbed wire and minefields. This hugely challenging assignment was given to the 1st Canadian Army, a multinational force made up of 2 Canadian and 2 British infantry divisions, with 1 Canadian and 1 Polish armoured division. The army included many Normandy veterans, but their hard-won combat experience was now being diluted by the arrival of raw recruits to replace casualties.
Some of them had been in the army less than 6 months. They brought them overseas, crossed the channel, onto the trucks and up to the front, and dumped them off. As we were trying to whip everybody into shape, they didn't know how to load a rifle, they didn't know how to prime a grenade, they knew nothing about infantry work.
In command of the army was Lieutenant General Guy Simonds. Simonds was a born soldier who'd won the Sword of Honour at Canada's Royal Military College. An expert in the evolving art of mechanized warfare, his rise to senior command had been meteoric, leading a division in Sicily and a corps in Normandy. When his boss, Lieutenant General Crerar, commanding 1st Canadian Army, fell ill, Simonds was the obvious replacement, and at 41 became the Western Allies' youngest army commander by 7 years.
Very British Canadian, he had been born in Britain. His father had been an officer in the British Army. His grandfather had been an officer in the army of the East India Company. Very highly regarded by Montgomery, by Eisenhower and by Bradley, perhaps in contrast to the actual commander of 1st Canadian Army, General Sahari Crerar, a Canadian who was found to be a little difficult to work with. The other way of looking at that is that they regarded Simonds as a good officer because he thought much the same way that they did, that Montgomery found Simonds easier to cooperate with, and so did many others.
Simonds' job was made more difficult by fierce disagreements about Allied strategy that autumn. The Supreme Allied Commander, General Eisenhower, favoured an advance against Germany on a broad front. But British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery believed that a single thrust across the Rhine River would get the Allies to Berlin and end the war by Christmas. Such a move, if successful, would make German defences along the Scheldt irrelevant. So that September, Simonds' advance on the Scheldt was put on pause, while Montgomery launched his ambitious airborne operation, codenamed Market Garden. But Market Garden ended in disaster.
The paratroopers took the bridges and held them until we got there. We took over from the American paratroopers at Nijmegen, and the next one after that was Arnhem, and that's the one they couldn't get. And that's where our paratroopers dropped in and got slaughtered.
And of course they had Market Garden, the airborne, bridge too far. They had that, and that failed. So they said, well, we've got to get Antwerp open.
The failure of Operation Market Garden not only cost lives and resources. By delaying the Canadian attack on the Scheldt, the task had been made significantly harder. The Germans made good use of their 4 weeks' breathing space, moving thousands of reinforcements into position along the estuary. By the time Montgomery accepted that clearing the Scheldt Estuary must be the new priority, German defences were more formidable than ever. That October, the Western Allies were relying on 1st Canadian Army to get the job done. It was up to them to clear German defenders from the Scheldt Estuary, so that urgently needed supplies and reinforcements could make it through to the port of Antwerp. Until now, 1st Canadian Army's efforts had been overshadowed by events elsewhere, but no longer. The Canadian plan involved 4 phases. Phase 1. 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, supported by 4th Canadian Armoured, would push north from Antwerp to secure Woensdrecht and Bergen op Zoom at the neck of the South Beveland Peninsula. Phase 2, 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and 1st Polish Armoured would eliminate German forces along the south bank of the Scheldt. Phase 3, Canadian troops would advance up the narrow South Beveland Peninsula, before Simmons launched Phase 4, an attack on Walcheren Island by land and sea. One of the biggest challenges facing the troops would be the treacherous landscape. The terrain was wet and boggy, with open country crossed by dikes and waterways.
The land around the Scheldt was polder territory. This meant that it had been reclaimed from the sea. The land was divided up by dikes, and between them, it had been flooded by the Germans.
They had flooded the land and you're in water all the time. The only protection you get is if you try to get too high on the what do you call the dikes, then you're a target.
The dikes themselves were steep embankments, like ramparts about 14 feet high, and made ideal defensive positions for the Germans. With hardly any usable roads for tanks, the struggle for the Scheldt would be overwhelmingly an infantry battle.
Why didn't the Air Force just go and flatten the place? Just flatten the place. They got all kinds of ammunition. No, send the infantry in there. It's terrible, terrible.
More than ever, Canadian soldiers would rely on the weapons and equipment they could haul forwards themselves over the flooded plains and steep embankments.
The Canadian Army in 1944 were equipped and armed almost identically to the British Army, and that went for the tactics and training too. Every platoon, most men were armed with the No. 4 Lee Enfield rifle. The section commanders were all armed with Sten submachine guns. But unlike the Germans, which was very, very beautifully made, high-precision engineering, these were cheap. The whole thing made for 15 shillings. There were only 2 pieces which were machined, the barrel and the breech block. The rest of it just made out of stamped steel, welded together. But actually, they weren't that reliable. The main infantry support weapon was the Bren light machine gun. The Bren was an incredibly accurate, beautifully designed weapon, completely reliable, and was quite capable of putting 2 bullets through the same hole with a well-trained gunner. These weapons and tactics, which had been honed in the fighting since Normandy, suddenly meant nothing in the fighting in the Scheldt because the land was flooded, there wasn't the opportunity for manoeuvre, and the troops were funneled through drainage ditches, through dikes, and across causeways. So they were having to advance on an incredibly narrow front. And on the other side, the Germans knew exactly where they would be coming from.
Those German defenders were being exhorted to ever greater levels of sacrifice by their Führer, who had implemented a new strategy, the Festung, or fortress city.
Hitler designated certain areas as fortress zones or fortress cities, and his goal was really to invigorate the defenders of those cities, to make them fight to the last man, to not surrender, to sell themselves as dearly as possible, and really to destroy the usefulness of those areas in the process. He did this with a number of port cities. He did this with the estuary outside of Antwerp. And the goal was really to slow the Allies down as much as possible.
But that summer, the German army had suffered disastrous losses in men and equipment, both in France and on the Eastern Front. It was now relying increasingly on teenagers and second-rate conscripts. the ragtag mix of divisions holding the Scheldt typified the Wehrmacht's diminished strength. 64th Division, defending the south bank of the Scheldt, was the strongest, with 11,000 men and a large number of heavy weapons. The 3 divisions of 67 Corps, holding the area north of Antwerp, were at half strength, and most were poorly trained. While 70th Division, holding Walcheren Island, was made up of men who, until recently, had been classed as medically unfit for service.
Previous fighting and the huge casualties had inflicted so many losses on the German army that they were simply not able to find enough recruits to refill their ranks. So what they did at that particular time is that they would go into hospitals, to military hospitals, and also draft people who up to that point had been medically unfit, and would draft them into specific units.
You see what are called stomach battalions of men who are otherwise fit but who need a special diet. Ear battalions of men who have ear damage or hearing damage and need special doctors, or foot battalions. All of these are simply being put back into the line, not as first-class infantry, but as men who can still fight.
On the 2nd of October, the Canadian 2nd Infantry Division opened the Battle of the Scheldt with an attack north from Antwerp. Their objective was to secure access to the South Beveland Peninsula, isolating German forces from the Dutch mainland. But they would need to fight their way through the villages of Hoogheide and Woensdrecht. At first, the Canadians made steady progress, overcoming sporadic German resistance and liberating several small villages on the Dutch-Belgian border. But as they neared their objective, they ran into a strong defensive network of roadblocks, anti-tank ditches, and assault guns. It was typical of the well-planned German defenses the Allies encountered throughout the battle.
The Germans had lots of time to prepare for us coming. I can remember they even had numbers on top of the roofs, 264 or something. And that was the infantry would see that number and call back for artillery fire. And they'd be able to, very quickly, be able to know exactly where that was. And so they used to shell us, but they had lots of time to prepare.
On the 7th of October, bitter fighting erupted around Hoogheide and Woensdrecht, with the Germans determined to keep control over the crucial access to South Beveland.
The town of Hoogheide, which overlooked Woensdrecht, and they had heavy artillery, mortars, at a very, very short distance. You could see the people operating the weapons on that hill.
The German 15th Army had clear orders from its commander. The people and Führer of Germany were watching, they were told. The Scheldt defenses must be held to the end. That commander was General Gustav Adolf von Sangen. An experienced officer who'd led a division on the Eastern Front, he'd been given command of 15th Army in the Calais region of France 6 weeks earlier. Despite heavy Allied attacks, he'd successfully withdrawn his units to Holland and established a formidable defensive line around the Scheldt.
He was a very driven commander, and he made clear to his troops that the fighting in the Scheldt Estuary was of the utmost importance for the future conduct of war and the future of Germany.
Contrary to the impression given by newsreel propaganda, by autumn 1944, German tanks were in short supply. The very few armoured units at von Sangen's disposal would instead rely on simpler, but highly effective, mobile assault guns.
At the beginning of World War II, the Germans have developed a vehicle called an assault gun, or Sturmgeschütz. And the idea is really you get a tank chassis, you put a support howitzer in it with a superstructure on the top, and that helps the infantry to attack prepared positions. After the invasion of Russia in June of 1941, Hitler makes a suggestion that the 7.5 centimetre anti-tank gun is added to the Sturmgeschütz chassis, and that changes the vehicle into a great tank-killing weapon. One of the issues with the Sturmgeschütz is low in profile because it doesn't have that turret, and that means it's an effective weapon to be able to hide, and it's also, because it's smaller, a harder weapon to hit. As the war progresses, the Germans are trying to thicken the armour, but they're losing some of their production facilities. So if you actually look on this example of a Sturmgeschütz, this extra armour that's been placed on the front is actually concrete, just to thicken the levels of protection for the crew inside. The problem, of course, is this cannot be turned on like a 360 turret. So it's great in the defensive role, but less good in the attack.
The assault guns that stalled the Canadian advance at Hoogerheide belonged to a German Kampfgruppe, or battle group.
The near-complete destruction of the larger organization of the German army in the West meant that there were a lot of units that were not with who they had started out with, were not organized, had suffered heavy casualties. And the Germans found that the best way to use them were simply to put them together into an informal group, a Kampfgruppe, and send them back out to fight together.
This particular Kampfgruppe is a very good example of it. Kampfgruppe, or battle group Scheldt, were named after their commanding officer, Generalleutnant Lieutenant General Scheldt. The Canadian intelligence report classed him as a very skillful and very driven military commander. They assembled a battle group, a Kampfgruppe of about 3,000 men, consisting of remnants of 3 infantry divisions, in particular the 85th Infantry Division, together with a number of paratroopers. And these 3,000 men became, as the Germans call them, the fire brigade of the Scheldt Estuary. They were one of the most powerful and experienced combat formations that the Germans had. And whenever there was heavy fighting, this particular unit would be sent.
Kampfgruppe Hill put up fierce resistance and launched fast-moving, hard-hitting counterattacks whenever possible. The Canadians suddenly found themselves in the hardest fighting they'd seen since Normandy. The intensity of combat threatened to overwhelm some units, and for one regiment would lead to complete disaster. The Canadian Black Watch had a reputation as an unlucky regiment. In Normandy, in one disastrous attack, its 2 senior officers had been killed, and the regiment cut to pieces. On Friday, the 13th of October, the same regiment was ordered to lead an attack on a railway embankment held by paratroopers of Kampfgruppe Hill. It would go down in Canadian military history as Black Friday.
They held the high ground on the right, and we were down on the flatlands with 2 or 3 polders as our protection. The Germans had the last polder. They had the very last polder. And as soon as you put your head up, there'd be a grenade come at you. And there was the railway tracks on the left with high ground there, which they also occupied. Our purpose was to advance past those polders, get to the railway station and cut off the enemy's movements on the road and the railway. We couldn't do it. We lost all those men. Black Friday the 13th.
The 4 attacking companies of the Black Watch lost 150 men killed, and the embankment remained in German hands.
One of the main problems that the Canadians are facing, which lead to these very high casualty rates, is the fact that communications are very poor. When C Company starts its attack, the preliminary artillery bombardment comes in too early, and so it comes in 30 minutes before the infantry actually starts its attack, which of course gives the Germans enough time to get back into their positions and prepare their weapons for the advancing Canadians.
The Canadians attacked again 3 days later. Finally, through tenacity and sheer weight of fire, they fought their way into what remained of the Dutch village of Woensdrecht. At high cost, the Canadians had cut off the South Beveland Peninsula and the 15,000 Germans defending it. Meanwhile, Simmons had launched the second phase of the battle on the southwest bank of the Scheldt, dubbed the Breskens Pocket. The Canadians' first obstacle was the Leopold Canal. General Simmons believed the attack to clear the Breskens Pocket, codenamed Operation Switchback, would take 4 days. It began on the 6th of October with an assault across the Leopold Canal. For some companies, the crossing was carried out in eerie silence.
We were under orders not to shoot unless we were attacked. And we suddenly realized the Germans must be under the same order too, because they see us, but they're not shooting anything either. So it was a kind of a silence on the canal.
A few Canadian companies got across the canal without coming under fire. But others were not so lucky and ran into fierce opposition, taking heavy losses. Allied intelligence, it later emerged, had seriously underestimated the strength of German forces in the Breskens Pocket. Slowly, the Canadians carved out a bridgehead on the far bank of the canal. Walter Balfour, a machine gunner with the 4th Canadian Armoured Division, spotted a German artillery observer guiding fire onto his unit.
So I opened up on them with the Bren gun. I had rolled down off the top of the dike because they opened up with a machine gun right away on trying to cut the top of the dike. But later on, the other troops farther up said they saw 2 stretcher bearers, German stretcher bearers, come out very cautiously, wondering whether they might, whether they were going to be shot or what, they could get. And they didn't bother, let them. They said they went up to where this brush pile was and loaded a guy on the stretcher and took him out. But that solved the problem for these guys who were on the bottom of at the canal bank, because he was creating a lot of havoc, a lot of rough times for them.
As the attack across the canal ran out of momentum, Simmons launched the Canadian Highland Brigade in a daring amphibious flanking attack on Hoofdplaat. The attack would be made with the help of an extraordinary new amphibious vehicle, originally designed for a somewhat sunnier climate.
This vehicle's what's called a buffalo, and it was developed from a design to pick up people in the Florida Everglades. The idea being that it can float, but it's also got tracks. The tracks were developed in a way that they've got these scoops on, so as they turn, they can propel a vehicle through water. Now, the American military liked the idea, and the British and Canadian forces use them as well. So to clear the Scheldt Estuary and the island of Walcheren at the end of it, a number of operations took place. And that's when the Buffalo, with its amphibious capability, its ability to take men across boggy ground, crossing rivers, dikes, even the open sea, it came into its own.
But the Canadians had had almost no time to train with the new amphibious vehicles, forcing the operation to be postponed by 24 hours. When the attack went ahead, it was a complete success. Canadian infantry landing behind the German lines, virtually unopposed. The Germans immediately concentrated every available gun against this dangerous new bridgehead. Doug Vidler was a mortarman with the Canadian Highland Brigade.
It was a bad night. We'd been up all night. We didn't get to bed till 8 o'clock or something in the morning, but around 11 o'clock, a shell hit the top of our barn, and the shrapnel and dust and everything all came down. And Bob was laying beside me, and we were laying under a manger kind of thing. The word went out, anybody hit? And Blackie said he was hit. He got hit in the knee. So with that, I shook Bob and said, Bob, Blackie's hit. And with that, Bob rolled over. He had one little piece of shrapnel on his head. Just one little piece, hardly bled at all. And he was gone.
For 3 days, Doug Wittler and his comrades held on to their fragile bridgehead. Finally, tank destroyers and infantry of 4th Canadian Armoured Division broke through to relieve them. The German position in the Breskens pocket was now hopeless. But the German commander ordered his men to fight on, even though many frontline units had lost 2/3 of their men, and most of the survivors were ready to give up. Canadian 3rd Division began a relentless, methodical advance across the pocket, smashing any point of German resistance with concentrated artillery fire and airstrikes. Ochil Stewart, a D-Day veteran, entered what he took to be a recently liberated Dutch village.
Everything was deathly silence as I got into the town. Not a soul, not a sound. And just behind me, out of the windmill, came the Burgermeister with about 20 of his town people. And so I went over to them. They hugged me and kissed me, and I said, "Did you not get all this hugging and kissing out of your system when the infantry came through yesterday?" "Oh, you're the first one. The infantry were repulsed by the Germans. They're back a mile or so. You're the first one."
On the 3rd of November, the pocket finally fell, with the surrender of the German divisional commander and the rest of his troops. The Canadians were slowly tightening their grip on the estuary, though at a heavy price. Now it was time to launch their final assault on Walcheren Island and the coastal guns that dominated the Scheldt. For both sides, autumn on the Dutch coast promised to be wet and freezing cold.
There wasn't a guy whose main objective was to find a warm, dry place where he could have a good sleep. Never mind the German. Where can we find a warm, dry place to have a good sleep? We were all half conscious.
It was cold. There was ice forming on the edge of the canal. The green grass had covered in white frost.
Soldiers fought a daily battle to get warm, stay dry, and find hot food.
The Scheldt was freezing cold. The Canadians find themselves having to fight in greatcoats, in the thick woolen greatcoats. They're wearing balaclavas. They have leather jerkins on, anything to keep warm and to try and keep the water out. The Canadian and British rations weren't very imaginative. In fact, nowhere near as exciting as the menus that the American Army often had. Amongst the things that they got in their 24-hour ration packs were 10 of these biscuits, which was basically a bread substitute, and these could be broken up and used for making breadcrumbs and other things. There would be meat extract, blocks of meat, oatmeal blocks. There were 2 bars of chocolate, boiled sweets, chewing gum, salt. So all sorts of things to make very, very simple food. And you would cook these on a little hexamen stove, which you carried in your pack, which opened out like this. You'd have a hexamen block, which is the fuel, which would sit in the space underneath. And once you'd lit it, you could then put your food into the mess tin, put it on top of the stove, and cook it off. Another innovation at the time was self-heating tins of food, like this tin of mock turtle soup. And the idea here was that you would take your army jackknife, you would punch 2 holes in the side of the lid, lever off the cap, and then light the fuse inside, leave it for 5 minutes, and when you cut it open, it would be steaming hot soup ready to eat.
Added to the general discomfort of Canadian troops was a growing crisis of combat fatigue. The Canadian 2nd and 3rd Infantry Divisions had been in almost constant combat since Normandy, and because of a Canadian law governing overseas service, they weren't getting enough replacements from home.
The Canadian Army was starting to experience substantial manpower issues late in 1944. In addition to the casualties they had experienced during the earlier fighting, the Canadian Army in Europe was built out of people who had actually volunteered to leave Canada and fight in Europe. Not everybody did that, and that meant that the Canadians were facing a shortage of people who were willing to fight in Western Europe. In addition to the shortage itself, the Canadian troops who were actually in Europe were beginning to get a little worn down, and there was no relief in sight. More and more Canadian soldiers began to break down under the strain, whether physically wounded, physically ill, or battlefield exhaustion.
In the First World War, they called the guy shell shock. We called it battle fatigue. Guys got battle fatigue a couple of weeks after we got into action. And they were no good anymore, most of them. They sent them back to what we called anyway, a sleep camp. And they'd give a guy a needle and put him to sleep for a day or 2 days and give him a chance to rest up. Keep him there for 3 or 4 days and send him back up. Well, the theory was 2 trips to the sleep camp and you went into a labor battalion. But we were so short of men, we had no labor battalions that I ever heard of, so they kept sending them back. And, you know, it was a damn disgrace. Some of the guys deserted. I had a guy who was a very close friend of mine and a tip-top soldier. But once the mortar shells started coming in, he'd get up and start running around in circles. And I'd have to jump on him and put him down and sometimes punch him out to keep him quiet.
Despite the growing crisis of manpower, 2nd Canadian Infantry were now given another vital role to play in the 3rd phase of the Battle of the Scheldt. General Simmons wanted them to attack west along the narrow peninsula as part of Operation Vitality, ahead of the final assault on the coastal batteries of Walcheren Island. So the weary Canadians prepared for another attack across the broken dikes and flooded fields. They would be facing soldiers of the German 6th Parachute Regiment. Many were as exhausted, physically and psychologically, as the Canadians. But even though the struggle to hold the Scheldt looked increasingly doomed, the Germans continued to fight doggedly. They had at least been safe from Allied air attacks for the last few weeks, thanks to heavy cloud and bad weather. But whenever the skies cleared, Hawker Typhoons and Supermarine Spitfires, armed with rockets and cannon, swarmed in to strafe German positions. John Thompson was the Canadian pilot of a rocket-firing Typhoon.
Anybody on the ground, it sounded like an express train coming, particularly a salvo. And the Germans, they were very leery about when they got attacked by typhoons. They didn't like the noise. That several of the German prisoners would say, well, yeah, the noise of those rockets is pretty terrifying.
In late October, the Allies used radio intercepts to pinpoint General von Sangen's headquarters and sent 4 squadrons of Typhoons to wipe it out. The attack killed 74 German officers and left 15th Army headquarters in chaos for days. The Canadians hoped to take advantage with a fresh attack along the peninsula. They had learned the lesson of Black Friday. This time, German defenses were blasted by a massive artillery barrage before the infantry went in under cover of darkness.
We moved in there about 2 o'clock in the morning and laid in the ditch on one side of the road until about 6, when we were told to charge. The charge was across about 1,000 yards of beet fields, flat as a pancake, nothing there but beets, and to take a dike on the far side being held by the German. We hardly got across the road when we had to retreat back into the ditch because of the machine gun, and the fire was so heavy you couldn't move. Somehow or other, we worked our way across that beet field to the dike at the end. There was very few of us left when we got there. We couldn't do much, but we spent the rest of the day throwing grenades back and forth, the Germans on one side and us on the other side, and they were just murder. The wounded were laying out in the field, hollering and yelling.
The Canadian infantry struggled forward, and by the end of the first day, they'd breached the first line of German defenses and taken 120 prisoners. But the next obstacle was even more formidable: the South Beveland Canal.
The German defense in the South Beveland sector is centered around this particular canal. The canal is a big obstacle to the Allied forces, and it's very difficult for them to cross this under fire. And the Germans therefore include this as an integral part into their defensive plan.
Rather than tackle the canal head-on, General Simmons ordered an outflanking attack by the 52nd Lowland Division, using buffaloes to land at Hurtgen. At a stroke, this bold amphibious operation bypassed the canal and made it worthless as a defensive position. The German troops hurriedly pulled back to Walcheren Island itself, where they would make their last stand, protected by concrete fortifications and coastal batteries. 4 weeks into the battle for the Scheldt, the Allies were closing in on their goal, the naval guns of Walcheren Island.
Blocking the end of the Scheldt Estuary was the island of Walcheren. Walcheren was heavily defended by the Germans. It was basically very flat and low-lying and surrounded by a dike, and the Germans had built concrete pillboxes and guns emplaced around the top of that dike.
Until Walcheren Island was taken and its heavy guns neutralized, no Allied ships could sail up the Scheldt to Antwerp, and the advance on Germany remained stalled through lack of supplies. By now, General Dasser, commanding what Hitler optimistically termed Scheldt Fortress North, could call only on the remnants of 70th Infantry Division, the 89th Fortress Regiment, and 2 battalions of naval gunners. Their orders from the Führer remained clear: fight to the last man. Meanwhile, Canadian Commander Guy Simmons was devising another bold amphibious operation for the final assault on Walcheren Island. First, the RAF would bomb Westkapelle, destroying the island's outer dike and allowing the sea to rush in and flood the interior. Then he would launch 2 amphibious assaults by Scottish infantry and Royal Marine commandos, landing at Vlissingen and Westkapelle, while 2nd Canadian Infantry attacked from the east across the narrow channel separating Walcheren from the mainland.
Montgomery built up a massive assault force to take the Walcheren fortress. Lots of landing crafts, lots of Buffalo amphibious vehicles, and thousands of men. And the plan was essentially a replica of what had happened at Normandy on June 6, 1944. A massive initial bombardment followed by waves of landing craft and amphibious vehicles taking the soldiers ashore to capture the fortress and finally open up Antwerp to Allied supply ships.
The Canadians began their attack on the 31st of October, but reaching the channel, they soon found it was too deep to cross on foot and too muddy for assault boats. The only option was to advance up the Walcheren Causeway, a single narrow road a mile long, connecting the island to the mainland. Company after company was sent up the causeway, only to get pinned down by heavy German fire.
So they lined the guys up in rows and send them across this damn thing, and you couldn't move. The Jerry's were sitting at the far end, machine gun fire. They had old French 75mm cannons shooting them like machine guns down the middle. And they kept sending more and more guys, and we were given covering fire. I smoked a can of 100 cigarettes in about 3 hours, believe it or not. Just lighting one off the other. We were just changing barrels on the Bren gun. Between their guys and ours, they finally got a half a dozen guys or so to the far end. But that was it.
With the Canadians pinned down on the causeway, the success of the attack would depend on Simmons' amphibious landings. The RAF bombing raid had been a success, blowing giant gaps in the dikes and flooding the island. The way was clear for Allied amphibious vehicles to strike at the heart of the German defensive positions.
When the attack went in, amphibious vehicles like this Buffalo could go through those gaps and round the rear of the dikes and attack the German defences from behind. And the Buffaloes would be perfect for this because not only could they carry men ashore, they were armour-plated on the front on this LVT-4 model Buffalo, and they were given guns. So it's got a 20mm Polston cannon and Browning machine guns on it that would help put suppressing fire down on the German positions as they come ashore and release the infantry to finish the attack.
Royal Marine Jim Kelly was part of the Buffalo assault wave, but things didn't go quite to plan.
They were put into tank landing craft, and we got into the Buffaloes inside the tank landing craft, so that we were loaded into the Buffalo, but the Buffalo was an amphibious box. We came out the landing craft in this thing, and right away it was bogged down in the water. Never got any further. We had to get out and wade ashore. It's just the same old wet landing. A freezing cold day, 1st of November.
At Vlissingen, the island's main port, the Germans were caught off guard, and British troops landed almost unscathed. But resistance intensified as they moved inland. They were soon engaged in fierce street fighting that would last several days. Meanwhile, off Westkapelle, a covering force of landing craft took on the heavy German shore batteries with rockets and cannon.
They were taking on the batteries, but they were a bit of a one-sided fight. That was, and they lost quite a few. But at least they did the job. They took the fire away from us, so we were able to get in and get on top of the batteries.
Under the cover of this barrage, the Marines got ashore with only light casualties. On the beaches and dikes, they faced no more than sporadic resistance from the Germans. But occasional mortar shells and mines claimed a steady toll. German S-mines, known as bouncing Bettys, were lethal.
We actually go over the top, just come over the top of the dunes and then start trotting towards and take a chance on the mines. But what we used to do, really, on the minefields was up skirts and at them. Because the faster you ran, if you stood on a mine, the better the chance you had of getting away with it. Because it took about 4 seconds to pop up out of the ground to about 6 foot high before it exploded in shrapnel balls. So if you ran fast enough, you could get away with it, which you did. It worked.
The fighting on Walcheren Island lasted 8 days. Then, on the 8th of November, the Germans began to surrender.
The next morning, they would come out with all their gear packed, the little haversacks and whatnot, and they'd come out and just surrender.
With the German coastal batteries neutralised, Royal Navy minesweepers went to work, making the Scheldt Estuary safe for Allied supply ships. On the 28th of November, the first Allied convoy sailed up the Scheldt to unload its precious supplies at Antwerp docks. The first ship to unload was from Canada. The opening of Antwerp was a serious blow to the Third Reich.
The significance of the Scheldt and Antwerp is really underlined by the enemy reaction. More V-2 rockets were aimed at Antwerp than any other place during that part of the war. Antwerp was also highly significant in the terms of Hitler's final offensive in the war, the Ardennes Offensive, because the objective there was to retake Antwerp, cut off the supplies, and undermine the whole of the Allied war effort on the Western Front.
The battle for the Scheldt was a hard-fought, 5-week campaign led by Canadian troops, who paid a heavy price for their success. Around 7,000 of the 12,000 Allied casualties were Canadians. The battle cost the Germans between 10 and 12,000 men and more than 40,000 prisoners. Victory transformed the situation for the Western Allies and ensured their forces would have the fuel and ammunition they needed for the final push into Germany. But it was a victory for which many Canadians believed, then and now, that their country never received proper recognition.
First ship up the Scheldt was a Canadian destroyer. A lot of dignitaries from the different regiments. Somebody said, "Where are the Canadians?" Nobody invited us. Even though we did a lot in the Battle of the Scheldt Estuary.
In September 1944, as American troops reached the German frontier, they faced a bitter struggle to break through a massive network of defenses that stretched from the Netherlands in the north to Switzerland in the south, known to the Allies as the Siegfred Line.
Und wir sagten uns, wir verteidigen hier, weil die Amerikaner praktisch in unser Heimatland eingedrungen sind.
It would be the longest continuous battle fought by the US Army in World War II, with a devastating physical and psychological toll on its troops. This is the story of the battle for the Siegfred Line. By the autumn of 1944, Hitler's Germany was under direct attack on two fronts. On the Eastern Front, Stalin's Red Army had advanced as far as Poland and Romania. In the West, British and American-led forces were nearing the German border and preparing to attack along a broad front to break through into the German homeland. In the Allies' path lay the Siegfred Line, known to Germans as the Westwall, a belt of fortifications stretching nearly 400 miles from the Netherlands to the Swiss border.
The Westwall, or as the Allies called it, the Siegfried Line, was a German defensive structure erected in the interwar period, mainly in the 1930s, on the German-French border as a defensive measure to protect German territory against the French. It was only in 1944 that the Germans realized or remembered that they had this defensive structure. The problem was that the defenses were inadequate, and they also hadn't been maintained, and so the Westwall offered a little bit of support to the Germans, but it was not the threatening defensive line that the Allies thought it was.
Very much as with the Atlantic Wall, areas were stronger or weaker, but it did at least provide the Germans with fortifications on which they could rest for the winter of 1944-45.
As the Allies drew near, the Germans worked hurriedly to reinforce the Siegfried Line defenses. They had the potential to pose a formidable obstacle. A fortified zone of concrete bunkers and pillboxes, minefields, barbed wire, and concrete obstacles known as dragon's teeth that were impassable to tanks.
I remember the Siegfried Line very easily as we were coming up to it. It was a lot of concrete emplacements already there, waiting for somebody to attack. And there were underground passages connecting these to them, and they had a lot of artillery firing at us.
The Allies needed to bust through these defenses to advance into Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr. But to everyone's surprise, on the 11th of September 1944, a US patrol approached a section of the Siegfried Line near the German-Luxembourg border and found it deserted. Within hours, they'd become the first US troops into Germany, without a shot fired. The commander of US 7th Corps saw an opportunity too good to miss and drew up a plan to break through the Siegfried Line before the Germans could reinforce it. That commander was General Lightning Joe Collins. Joseph Lawton Collins was one of the few generals to see action in both the European and Pacific theaters of war, having commanded an infantry division during the Battle of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands in 1943. His division's nickname in the Pacific, Tropic Lightning, led to his own nickname, Lightning Joe. Just before the D-Day landings, General Eisenhower gave the 47-year-old Collins command of 7th Corps, making him the youngest Corps commander in the US Army.
He was a very aggressive, very smart guy who modeled himself to a certain extent on George Patton, and was one of the new wave of much less cautious, much less methodical American general officers who were beginning to appear at that point in the war.
Collins' 7th Corps was one of 3 that made up General Courtney Hodges' US 1st Army. 7th Corps had 2 highly experienced infantry divisions, the 1st and 9th, which had both seen action in North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy, while the 3rd Armoured Division had been in combat since June and was boldly and aggressively led by General Maurice Rose. Collins turned to General Rose's 3rd Armoured to lead the attack through the Siegfried Line, with the division operating as 2 combat commands, A and B.
The American combat command system started up in the 1930s and into the 1940s, and it was at least in part a reaction to the new requirements of industrialized warfare. The Americans discovered that they didn't always need full-size divisions to do everything that they were thinking about, or that full-size divisions didn't have everything they needed within them. And so what they started to do was put together combat commands, which might draw from an armored division, draw from an infantry division, an artillery, an engineer division, and put together units as one big fighting force, commanded by someone who could use them in whatever way was best.
The initial American penetration of the Siegfried Line had been made just south of Aachen. Now, 3rd Armoured's 2 combat commands would attack northeast, near the German town of Hürtgen. Once the tanks had broken through, they'd continue the advance to Stolberg, while 1st Infantry Division swung left to capture the high ground east of Aachen, and 9th Infantry pushed into the Hürtgen Forest to secure 7th Corps' right flank. On the 12th of September, Combat Command A and B began their advance against the Siegfried Line. With tanks providing fire support, infantry working their way forward to outflank pillboxes and bunkers, and engineers clearing obstacles, the Americans began fighting their way through the fortified zone. Over 4 days of combat, the 3rd Armoured advanced an average of 2 miles a day, fighting its way methodically through the belt of defences. But as US troops neared Stolberg, they ran into a second chain of Siegfried Line defences, at the same time as they were hit by a series of German counterattacks. There was even a rare appearance by the German Luftwaffe.
That's where I was bombed at 250-pound or 500-pound. There's not much difference in them when they get that big. Hit the front yard of the building, only 20 to 30 feet from the building itself. I had only made it about halfway down the stairway when the bombs hit. And the concussion from it and so forth blew me the rest of the way down against the wall, and I turned around a couple of times because it blew me down. And I came out on the floor on my hands and knees sliding across the floor, and the German woman that lived there in that building, after it's over and the plane is gone, of course, by this time, and she looks at me and she sort of grins or laughs like and points at me, because she thought it was so funny the way I came down that stair and on my knees, hands and knees on the floor.
General Lightning Joe Collins believed his men had a golden opportunity to charge through the Siegfried Line while its defences were still only half occupied. But instead, he was informed that the vital supplies his men needed to continue their offensive were to be diverted elsewhere. After 4 days of combat, General Collins was forced to suspend his attack on the Siegfried Line. The cause was a severe Allied supply shortage, that even ingenious logistical improvisation couldn't solve.
Because they don't have enough rail capacity, the Americans at the end of August establish what's called the Red Ball Express, which is they treat French roads as if they're a railway. They make them one way only and establish a circuit for trucks travelling at their height, apparently one every 15 to 30 seconds, down the road to drop off its load, come back again as rapidly as possible. And that lasts through into October. But ultimately, the Allies just can't sustain the number of men with the fuel, and with the equipment, and with the ammunition they need to maintain the broad front without slowing down.
The Allies only had enough supplies for one major attack at a time, and priority was now switched to British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's Operation Market Garden. This was a plan to outflank the Siegfred line to the north, advancing through the Netherlands, over the Rhine and into Germany in a single bold operation. The plan relied on airborne troops seizing and holding several key river bridges, but Monty believed if it succeeded, it could win the war that year. The fallout was that Lightning Joe's 7th Corps and other units in the area would no longer get the fuel and ammo they needed to continue their own attack. The Allies had handed exhausted German forces a crucial breathing space, one their new commander would use to completely overhaul German defences. That new commander was Field Marshal Walter Model, a man so adept at fixing a crisis that he'd been nicknamed the Führer's fireman. Widely regarded as Germany's best defensive general, he was also known for his loyal support for Adolf Hitler and unsympathetic, no-nonsense attitude to those under his command.
He did an awful lot in a short space of time, reorganising units and preparing the defence. And in this, his experience was an ideal background, because he had fought so many defensive battles on the Eastern Front.
The fact that he is a completely driven and also committed soldier are summed up by many accounts that we see, that he was very tough and very hard against his own troops, because he really wanted to achieve things, but also very hard and tough against himself. And for that, the people admired and respected him.
Model's Army Group B was responsible for defending the Belgian and Luxembourg frontier with Germany. The area around Aachen was held by the 81st Corps of General Brandenberger's 7th Army. Many of its divisions had been almost completely destroyed during the fighting in France and remained severely under strength. The Corps' 2 panzer divisions could muster barely 20 tanks between them. But through September, reinforcements continued to arrive, including replacement tanks and new Volksgrenadier divisions.
In the autumn of 1944, the Germans built a new type of force, and these forces were the Volksgrenadier divisions. The problem was, for the Germans, the manpower shortage of 1944. So the Volksgrenadier divisions had a lower number of infantry battalions, so the manpower was quite low, and they tried to, at least in theory, overcome that by equipping them with more machines, in particular infantry weapons. What they also tried to achieve was that you would have a very experienced cadre of officers and NCOs, around which you would then form a body of men, maybe recruited from people back from the Reich who hadn't been drafted before, and also, in particular, from surplus numbers from the Air Force and from the Navy that were not being used anymore. This was the theory. In reality, it didn't really work that way. And so even though on paper these are very formidable formations, in reality they were not as formidable, not as strong, not as good as perhaps the standard units that you would find in the army.
Zusammengewürfelt. Man sah ja auch die verschiedensten Uniformen. Nicht wahr? Dort hatte einer eine Luftwaffenmontur an und es gab auch Leute mit Marinekleidung.
While US forces paused their attack on the Siegfred line, Nazi officials began to evacuate civilians from the city of Aachen, now threatened by the Allied advance. For Germany, Aachen had limited military value, but great symbolic importance.
Aachen was a deeply historic German city. It had been in existence for hundreds, if not thousands of years. It was Charlemagne's capital during the Frankish Empire. And so the Germans really treasured the city as a historic monument to their nation, to their history. In addition, it was the first major German city that was being attacked by the Allies. And so there was this sense that Germany herself was now under threat.
But Gerhard von Schwerin, commander of 116th Panzer, had already drafted a letter surrendering the city to the Americans.
But he never sent that letter because German reinforcements are rushed into the area and a counterattack is ordered, which stabilizes the front for some time, which then leads to rather heavy fighting in that particular area. This letter, say, was never sent, but it did make its way towards, or through the channels, you might say, towards Hitler, who basically wanted Schwerin persecuted and probably shot, but he very narrowly escaped that particular fate, so he was very lucky.
Meanwhile, to the north, after a week of intense fighting, Montgomery's Operation Market Garden ended in failure, as British troops were unable to break through to airborne units holding Arnhem Bridge. Lightning Joe's 7th Corps would now get the supplies it needed to resume its attack on the Siegfred line around Aachen. They'd be joined in the battle for the city by the US 19th Corps. September's advance by Collins' 7th Corps had left it holding the Stolberg Corridor, southeast of Aachen. North of the city, 19th Corps launched its attack across the Rur River near Übach, with the intention of swinging south to link up with US 1st Infantry east of Aachen, cutting off the city. 19th Corps' attack was preceded by major airstrikes, but fighter bombers failed to register a direct hit on a single pillbox, while the artillery's high explosive shells weren't powerful enough to penetrate the concrete bunkers. They would have to be taken by infantry assault. US combat engineers trained infantry units for challenges like this.
We'd take an infantry platoon and have them get a sheep and take the sheep and put it inside the pillbox, and then go out and then have a sample assault where we'd assault the back door, flamethrower into it, fire a bazooka into it, then put the 26-pound charge down the center in. And as soon as that charge went off, then we had the infantry run inside and told them to get that sheep. When they brought it out, they found the sheep was bleeding from its ears and eyes from the shock and concussion. And the infantrymen all decided they didn't want to be inside of a pillbox.
Using tactics like these, 30th Infantry Division captured 50 German pillboxes on the first day. But it was slow attritional fighting, and by the third day, 19th Corps had taken 1,800 casualties. On the 8th of October, 7th Corps' 1st Infantry Division joined the attack, taking Crucifix Hill, east of Aachen. But as the noose tightened around the city, there were fewer signs than ever that the Germans were about to give up.
Aachen was the first German city under attack, and the population of the city itself was German. German troops were defending not only their homeland, but German civilians themselves. Both of those things made the German soldiers very motivated to fight hard and fight for a long time.
By the 11th of October, US forces had surrounded the city. An ultimatum from the commander of the US 1st Infantry Division for the city to surrender or face destruction was rejected. And so American aircraft and artillery began to pulverize German positions in and around Aachen. Most civilians had been evacuated, but around 20,000 remained in the city, now trapped by fierce fighting. American infantry evolved new tactics for advancing through the streets. They made use of their overwhelming firepower to demolish entire houses if need be, to silence German resistance points. The cut-off German defenders, 5,000 men from a mix of units, fought stubbornly. But without outside help, their situation was hopeless. And so, east of Aachen, German forces launched a counterattack to try to break the American grip on the city. A regiment of the US 1st Infantry found itself facing the latest German heavy tanks, more powerful than even the legendary Tiger.
Despite the impressive nature of the Tiger I, the German military stops making them in the summer of 1944, and they move on to an even more impressive beast, the King Tiger, or Royal Tiger, Tiger II. And that's built because Hitler insists that the newer 88mm gun, which is even longer, even more powerful, is put on a tank chassis. Hitler's idea is that every year the German military must have a superior vehicle than whatever the enemy are going to be fielding.
When Frank Cam arrived at the front, he met comrades who had been there when the dreaded Tigers came rolling in.
I visited the engineers up there, and they told me about a Tiger tank that could just run right over their tanks, friendly mines, and roll down the street and stopped at each building and fired around into the basement of the building and kept rolling along, and then turned around at the end of the road and came back firing in the building on the other side of the road. And they were so tough that they couldn't stop them. So those things were scary.
But the Germans only had a handful of these powerful tanks, not enough to turn the tide of the battle. 11 days after the US ultimatum, with much of the city in ruins, Aachen's last German defenders surrendered. It was the Western Allies' longest battle for a city in World War II. Both sides suffered about 5,000 casualties, with 3,500 German soldiers taken prisoner. But the battle to break the Siegfred line was not over yet, and the next phase would prove an even more challenging environment. 10 miles southeast of Aachen, the Siegfred line wound through the dense pines and steep ravines of the Hürtgen Forest. Efforts to break the line here would lead to some of the most grueling and costly fighting on the Western Front. While 7th Corps' 1st Infantry Division had been fighting in Aachen, the 9th had plunged into the Hurtgen Forest, an area covering around 50 square miles south of Aachen. Corps Commander Major General Lightning Joe Collins had decided that if the forest remained in German hands, it would give the enemy an ideal base from which to threaten his southern flank as his men advanced east from Aachen. But the American decision to fight through this almost impassable terrain puzzled the Germans.
Wir auf deutscher Seite haben uns eigentlich immer gewundert, weshalb die Amerikaner versuchten, durch den Hürtgenwald zu kommen. Die hatten eine Überlegenheit mit Panzern von, sagen wir mal, 20:1 oder noch mehr. Die wären von Aachen aus mit ihren Panzern in wenigen Tagen über die Ebene am Rhein gewesen. Nein, die wollten unbedingt durch den dichten Hürtgenwald.
Hidden amongst the thick pine woods were concrete pillboxes, supported by minefields, trenches and wooden bunkers. The few routes through the forest wide enough for tanks were littered with mines. One American unit counted a German anti-tank mine every 8 paces for 3 miles. In the face of such formidable defences, it took the 9th Infantry 10 days to advance just 3,000 yards, at the cost of 4,500 casualties. It set the pattern for weeks of grueling combat, as more and more units were committed in an effort to bludgeon their way through the forest. In late October, the worn-out 9th Division was relieved by fresh troops of the Pennsylvanian 28th Infantry, in preparation for a new phase of the American battle to break through the Siegfried Line. The 28th Division had arrived in France a few weeks after D-Day. Its 3 infantry regiments had seen heavy fighting in Normandy, before marching down the Champs-Élysées in the parade to celebrate the liberation of Paris. But Hurtgen Forest would be unlike anything the division had seen or trained for. The 28th Division was to play a key role in the Allied advance towards the next objective, the Rur River. It would make a preliminary attack through the Hürtgen Forest to capture the important crossroads town of Schmidt and secure the flank of the main advance. This would be followed by the main attack, codenamed Operation Queen, which would see 7th Corps and 19th Corps push east towards their objective, the main town of Düren on the Ruhr. But a US advance through the Hürtgen Forest would threaten secret German preparations for a major winter offensive in the Ardennes Forest.
Unbeknownst to the Americans, their advance on Schmidt presented a serious strategic threat to the Germans. If the Americans captured Schmidt, they would actually be able to threaten the German buildup areas for the Ardennes counteroffensive. And so the Germans realized that they had to defend both the Hurtgen Forest and Schmidt itself against the American assault, because otherwise the entire counteroffensive would become difficult, if not impossible.
The US 28th Division would face heavier resistance than expected, and its commander already had serious concerns about his orders. The division was led by General Norman Dutch Cotter, a career soldier and West Point graduate who'd become a D-Day legend after coming ashore at Omaha Beach with the second wave and personally leading a charge through the enemy wire. He'd won the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions that day, and 2 months later was given command of the 28th Infantry Division, after its previous commander was killed by a German sniper. Cotter didn't believe his division was experienced or strong enough to clear the Germans from the forest. But his complaints fell on deaf ears, and on the 2nd of November, the 28th Division began its attack. Many GIs advanced through the forest with a sense of dread.
We didn't, of course, know where we were. We had no idea what we were in. Each of us was wanting the same thing. Which one of us is going to get killed first? Is one of us going to get that $1 million wound to go home? Is one of us going to get an arm blown off? We're going into combat, and they're shooting real bullets up there.
One regiment immediately walked into a large, unmarked minefield. Another was ambushed by expertly camouflaged German pillboxes in the forest and pinned down.
Die Amerikaner griffen an, die sahen uns nicht, wir waren ja bestens getarnt. Und greifen sie mal in der Dunkelheit und im Nebel und bei diesem Witterungsverhältnis Infanterie an, die in eingegrabenen Stellungen sitzen. Das ist die Hölle.
On the 3rd of November, American infantry took the town of Schmidt. Model, alarmed at the threat to preparations for the German winter offensive through the Ardennes, immediately ordered powerful counterattacks. At dawn the following day, German infantry attacked, supported by tanks of the 116th Panzer Division. The single American battalion holding Schmidt had no tanks or anti-tank guns to take on the panzers, just bazookas. It was clear that the 28th Division was going to lose all its gains without immediate tank support. But getting 35-ton tanks up the forest trails had so far proved impossible. Army engineers were now given just a few hours to make the forest trail to Schmidt passable, using hand tools and a single bulldozer. 3 Shermans finally made it up the track, just in time to help fight off the German panzers' counterattack. But the lead US regiment was under sustained assault by the best part of 2 German divisions. The Germans retook Schmidt, while the Americans desperately held out in the neighboring village of Kommerscheid. The forest was so dense it was impossible to maintain a front line, so infiltration and flanking attacks by small squads of infantry were a constant threat. General Cotter, for all his famed courage, was struggling to hold his division together, issuing orders for counterattacks that were so unrealistic, some junior commanders simply ignored them.
We had been let down by the senior officers. They simply didn't understand what was going on. They'd wipe out a company, and then they'd send another company in to do exactly the same attack that had failed before. They didn't seem to be learning from it.
Bad decisions led to thousands of casualties. Up to a third were classed as non-battle and included trench foot, frostbite, and dysentery. But combat took its toll in many ways, and prolonged exposure to battle resulted in psychological disorders. 26% of all US troops who served in combat units between June and November 1944 reported sick with combat fatigue at some time or another.
As more and more men broke down because of combat fatigue, rather than being punished, they were taken off the line, they were treated, some of them were sent back home for good, a lot of them were given a chance to recover. But the Army handled them pretty effectively over the long term because they knew that this was just something that happened to every soldier eventually. The other thing about combat fatigue was that the other soldiers recognized it and weren't dismissive or contemptuous of the men who experienced it. To a certain extent, there was a sense that, oh, this could be me. And so they tended to treat those folks who broke down mentally in combat with a kind of rough kindness.
In extreme cases, the misery and dread of frontline service drove some soldiers to go absent without leave.
Desertion was also a serious problem, and the only US soldier to actually be shot for desertion during the course of the war was Private Eddie Slovik. And that was a result of this campaign.
The decision to execute Eddie Slovik was approved by Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, deeply concerned by low morale among US units that winter. Slovik had been part of the ill-fated 28th Division, which continued to struggle forward through the Hürtgen Forest. General Lightning Joe Collins had planned for the 7th Corps to reinforce the division as part of a major attack codenamed Operation Queen on the 5th of November. But bad weather delayed the preliminary air bombardment for day after day. The 28th Division were left in the forest to bear the brunt of the German counterattacks on their own. Then, in the midst of the fighting, along a fiercely contested supply route through the forest known as the Cowl Trail, there was a moment of rare and courageous mercy.
Sind wir zu den Amerikanern mit einer weißen Fahne hingegangen, rübergegangen. Sie waren auf der anderen Seite des Flusses, der Kall.
3 times a day for 5 days, both sides paused the fighting and came together to help evacuate wounded soldiers. Dr. Gunther Stuttgen was a medic for the German 89th Infantry Division.
Ich hatte in meinem Bunker immer amerikanische Sanitätssoldaten, die mir halfen bei der Versorgung von amerikanischen Verwundeten, die antransportiert wurden. Und dann machte ich ihnen klar, dass sie keine Gefangenen wären und sie könnten wieder zurückgehen.
They even devised a way of sharing the water of the Cowl River without the fear of being attacked.
Ich hatte den Vorschlag gemacht, bin zu den entsprechenden Offizieren gegangen und habe denen gesagt, also lass uns doch, die Deutschen, ihr waschen sich von 8 bis 9 und ihr von ab 9 bis 10. Ja? Und das war eine Abmachung, die eben auch eingehalten wurde. Das erinnerte jetzt nachblickend in der Analyse, es war fast kriegsspielartig.
But the respite was short-lived. the 16th of November, with no end to the bad weather in sight, General Hodges ordered Operation Queen to go ahead, with or without the bombers. Miraculously, after 13 days of constant rain, the weather cleared at the last moment. More than 1,500 heavy bombers poured high explosive onto Siegfred Line defences and towns along the Rur River valley.
The effects were devastating. The towns that were hit by the bombers were basically obliterated. The communication lines were cut, and the effects on the morale, particularly of the inexperienced soldiers, was quite severe. Having said that, in the combat zone itself, where you had more of the experienced German soldiers, the effects were far less. There are a number of reasons for this. First of all, the bombing wasn't all that accurate in that particular area, and also a lot of the more experienced soldiers and their morale were not hit that badly. And it's interesting that after the bombing raid, even the Allied commanders said that the bombing had not lived up to their expectations.
In the aftermath of the bombing raid, Collins' 7th Corps launched its attack through and north of the Hürtgen Forest. They'd have to fight their way through a series of well-defended villages with the aim of securing new priority objectives, the Rur River dams, the significance of which had only just been grasped.
During the fighting, the Germans were thinking of blowing the dams of the River Rur. The idea behind that was that by blowing the dams, well, first of all, they would create a water wall which would move towards the Allies and hopefully sweep away some of the troops. But even more importantly, it would create a bit of, you might say, a swamp area and would widen the River Rur to about 1.5 kilometers, which made it very, very difficult for the Allies to cross. So creating a rather severe water obstacles to the advancing Allies.
The Americans knew that the Rur dams were there, but they had sort of lost focus on them in an attempt to secure their flank by taking the Hürtgen Forest. General Hodges of the American Army wasn't the most intelligent, most aggressive commander, and he was having trouble tracking everything that was going on. In the process, the dams sort of got lost in the mess.
US commanders finally understood that they could not safely cross the Rur River while the dams remained intact in German hands. But the shattered 28th Division would take no part in this attack. Cota's men were finally being pulled out of the line.
I felt, oh my God, we're getting out of this meat grinder. And the next day we got on the trucks and away we went. Down the mountains, over the rivers, through the woods. It was like luxury.
But for the veteran US 1st Infantry Division, it was the start of their Hürtgen Forest ordeal. On the first day of Operation Queen, they attacked the village of Hamish, where Harley Reynolds and his unit encountered a lethal new German infantry weapon.
The Germans had developed a pistol that shot a grenade, and they had developed this pistol. The idea was there all the time, but we'd never run up against them until this night. And they had developed it was a flare gun. Shoots a flare, just like you carry on your boat, for an example, if you're out on the water. But instead of a flare, it shot a grenade. Now, this is close quarters. You're talking about 20 to 30 yards, but that was one wicked thing, and it's our first time to ever run up against it. And they just slaughtered us. And it was 23 people that was left from the company.
It took 4 days for the 1st Division to take Hamish, at the cost of 1,000 casualties. Fighting the terrain, as well as a well-entrenched and skillful enemy, American infantry advanced at a snail's pace, about 1.5 miles in 5 days. American armor struggled in the muddy, heavily mined tracks of the forest. What's more, they were stalked by German infantry, equipped with handheld anti-tank weapons.
So the Panzerfaust can be used by units like the Volksgrenadiers in the Hürtgen Forest. They can creep up on tanks through the woods, and this very simple weapon can penetrate the armor on the front or the sides of a Sherman tank. So literally pennies are being used to knock out thousands of pounds worth of equipment.
All units in the Hurtgen Forest suffered a horrifying rate of attrition. For those on the front line, the nightmare seemed unending. Americans had given the forest a grisly nickname, the Death Factory. And with winter closing in, conditions were only getting more miserable.
I'd have to describe it in this way. In the beginning of winter, back in Virginia, where I grew up, it starts with a very cold blowing wind and just snow flakes, just here and there. But the flakes aren't actually flakes. They're in little balls like pellets. And that was all I saw of snow in the Hurtgen Forest while I was there. We knew the winter was coming.
November 1944. The US 1st and 9th Armies were waging a grim winter offensive along a 15-mile front in an attempt to push through the Siegfred line to the Rur River and then on to the Rhine itself. On the southern flank of the advance, US infantry were pinned down in the Hürtgen Forest, unable to make any headway through the wooded maze of ravines, minefields, and bunkers.
Dadurch alles das, was jetzt am Boden lag, konnten sich eigentlich in keiner Hinsicht still bewegen. Sie machten immer Krach, irgendwo knackte immer irgendwas. Und das hat natürlich die eine wie die andere Seite bemerkt und da wurde dann Feuer eröffnet.
One US regiment lost 200 men in a single day, and all 3 of its battalion commanders. Losses were so bad that some companies got through 3 or 4 commanding officers in a month. Many were below half their normal strength of 190 men. The need for replacements was more urgent than ever. But when new recruits were sent to frontline units to replace the casualties, they often struggled to fit in amongst the veterans.
The American manpower system was one of the great failings of American organization during World War II. The Americans, rather than pulling units off the line when they experienced heavy casualties and rebuilding them, would simply send out individual soldiers as replacements. And this IRR, Individual Ready Replacement System, turned out to not work very well at all. Among other things, it meant that they were sending new soldiers to veteran units who didn't know them, who had no connection to them, who had no chance to train with them ahead of time. And those units weren't terribly welcoming.
But the veterans weren't simply trying to be cruel. They were protecting themselves.
So these new replacements would come out and they would be incredibly vulnerable the first couple of weeks with the new unit, because they just didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know what the sound of a German machine gun was like compared to the sound of an American. They didn't know how to move through forests quietly. And so not only would they get themselves killed, but they'd get the other soldiers killed. One of the results of this, in a kind of horrifying way, is that a lot of the veteran soldiers refused to even learn the names of the replacements until they'd been with the unit long enough that those veteran soldiers had some sense that they would survive. It wasn't worth getting to know the new guy if he was just going to be dead the next day.
You know, big boys don't cry, you know, and you're not supposed to get so attached. And that's the thing we tried not to do, because we get new replacements, get to know them by their first name. 2 days later, they're dead. You were talking about 70% turnover all the time. If we had an 8-man squad, which is supposed to be 12, we thought that was a big deal. Hardly ever remember being full strength. They just killed us all the time.
In the last week of November, fresh attacks were made by 5th Corps towards Grosshau at the eastern edge of the forest and the town of Hürtgen. American infantry faced all the usual problems of fighting through the Hurtgen Forest. At Grosshau, just 2 Sherman tanks made it up the trails to support the attack. Both were immediately knocked out by German assault guns. At Hurtgen, American tanks coming up the road encountered craters and anti-tank mines. The lead tanks were soon immobilized, blocking the road for those behind. But thanks to a sudden break in the weather, Allied fighter-bombers were able to strafe and bomb German positions, and US infantry eventually took both villages. The American advance was inching forward at the cost of enormous casualties. And still, the Rur River dams were not in sight. And so Allied commanders turned to air power to destroy them. In early December, RAF bombers attacked the dams 3 times, but there was no repeat of the spectacular Dam Busters' success. The dams were made of packed earth and almost impossible to hit amid constant winter cloud cover. They would have to be taken by ground troops after all. Frank Cam's unit arrived at the front on the 13th of December and quickly got a taste of the fog of war in the freezing forest.
We had several different infantry platoons attack that first night on the 13th of December, and some of our soldiers got caught behind German lines. While it was dark, they had to try to get out, and they came across a German trench and were walking through the German trench when they ran into German soldiers. And the Germans would say something to them, and they just grunted back and kept on going. And they walked through the German lines and then came on out. So sometimes you engage them, and if they don't know who you are, you're all right.
German soldiers were also under immense pressure and faced the terrifying might of Allied firepower.
Und nachts war ich alleine. Nur Krachen, keine Verbindung mehr. Ich kann nur sagen, es kurz zu sagen, in dieser Nacht habe ich beten gelernt.
US troops, with the advantage in numbers and firepower, made steady progress towards the Rur River, while Hill 400, a crucial vantage point, was taken by an elite US Ranger battalion in a head-on charge. After months of bitter fighting, US 1st and 9th Armies finally reached the Rur River. Siegfred line defences, the horrors of Hurtgen Forest, and a skillful German defence meant they'd been forced to pay an exceptionally heavy price, and still hadn't made the breakthrough they'd hoped for. But as American commanders prepared for yet another assault towards the Rur dams, on the 16th of December, 25 miles to the south, Hitler launched a surprise midwinter offensive through the Ardennes Forest. It was the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last great offensive in the west, and meant troops in the Hurtgen Forest would be left holding their positions for the rest of a harsh winter.
At that point, the Battle of the Bulge was triggered, which went from December of 1944 into January of 45. They had pulled away all of our artillery support, all of our air support, and we had to dig in at the Rur River. It was cold and miserable, and fighting through the elements was a war in itself for us.
It was an indecisive end to a deeply flawed Allied campaign.
Hurtgen Forest was probably one of the bigger setbacks for the Allies on the Western Front. It was intended to really break through the Siegfred line in that area, and it didn't do that. And in addition, the Allies took massive casualties fighting their way through the terrain of the forest itself. And so the final result is they didn't really achieve what they were aiming for, and they lost more than 30,000 casualties doing it.
The defense of the Hürtgen Forest can be seen as a German victory. The Germans inflicted higher casualties on the Allies, the Americans, than they sustained themselves. The Germans lose somewhere in the region of about 28,000 casualties, whereas the Americans lose about 33,000 casualties, plus about 9,000 non-combat casualties. So some of the units have a 25% casualty rate, which is extremely high for American units. So at that particular level, yes, you might say it was a victory. It also slowed down the Allied advance, and the Germans were able to hold on to more of their territory. From an operational and strategic point of view, the answer is probably different. You might say, well, operationally it didn't really achieve all that much, whereas strategically it didn't have any effect at all, and Germany still lost the war.
The duration and intensity of fighting in the Hürtgen Forest would traumatize survivors on all sides.
Ich sehe dort heute noch die ganzen Toten liegen. Die amerikanischen Soldaten, die deutschen Soldaten, alles gemischt, die ganzen Felder voll.
General Dutch Coter's battered 28th Division, who'd been left out on a limb in Hürtgen Forest, were moved south to a quiet sector to recover. But in a grim irony, they found themselves in the path of Hitler's surprise winter offensive through the Ardennes. Not until the Battle of the Bulge had been won could Allied forces along the Siegfred line resume their offensive and begin the final advance into the heart of Nazi Germany. The 16th of December 1944, Hitler unleashed his final gamble in the west, a surprise counterattack in the dense forest of the Ardennes. He hoped it would change the course of the war and force the Allies to the negotiating table.
Der letzte Hitlerbefehl lautete, es kommt nicht darauf an, Geländegewinne zu machen, sondern es kommt darauf an, den Feind zu vernichten.
This is the story of America's deadliest battle of World War II, the Battle of the Bulge. By early December 1944, German soldiers were fighting a desperate battle to halt the Red Army's advance on the Eastern Front, as the Russians closed in on Germany. But in the West, recent German successes against Montgomery's airborne operation, Market Garden, and on the Rur River against the Americans, had brought a brief period of respite. They had now assembled a formidable strike force to carry out the Führer's plan for a counteroffensive through the Ardennes Forest of Belgium and Luxembourg to take out a critical Allied supply port.
The plan that was proposed by Hitler was that the German troops would advance through the Ardennes and reach the port of Antwerp, the big logistical hub of the Allied forces, and cut off the Allied supply of the troops fighting in and around the German border. The second objective was a political one, and by launching this offensive, Hitler wanted to show the Western Allies that there was still a lot fight left in the Germans, and he was trying to convince them it would be a good idea to make peace with the Germans and form an alliance with the Germans and fight together with the Germans against the Soviets.
The German army would attack through the same region where it had won its brilliant Blitzkrieg victory against France in 1940, the Ardennes, a rugged landscape of forest and hills spanning Belgium, France, and Luxembourg.
If you got into the Ardennes, you would go back to the 15th and 16th century. It had castles with moats and wooden drawbridges and things like that. And it was just absolutely beautiful.
Allied forces were thinly spread in this area. A quiet sector where units battered and exhausted after spending weeks in the bloody fighting along the Siegfred line could recover.
We came to relieve the 4th Infantry Division that was in Hürtgen Forest. They had lost 6,000 men. The 2nd Infantry had lost 2,000 men. They were all sent there to recuperate, get replacements, get back up to force.
But this quiet sector was about to bear the brunt of the most ferocious German offensive since D-Day. Unknown to the Allies, more than 200,000 men, 1,400 armored vehicles, 1,000 aircraft, and 2,600 guns and rocket launchers had been assembled for the task ahead. Adolf Hitler personally selected the best troops available and officers he trusted. 6th Panzer Army under SS Oberstgruppenführer Sepp Dietrich included two of the most powerful formations at Germany's disposal, the 1st SS and 2nd SS Panzer Corps. General von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army also contained several experienced panzer formations. They were supported by the 7th Army under General Brandenberger and 15th Army under General von Zangen. The lead role in the attack was given to 6th Panzer Army, assigned the shortest route to the primary objective, the critical Allied supply port of Antwerp. They had priority for supply and equipment. The 5th Panzer Army was assigned to the middle sector with the objective of capturing Brussels. In the southernmost sector, the 7th Army's task was to defend the flank of the main assault. The 15th Army, located on the far north of the Ardennes battlefield, was tasked with holding US forces in place, with the possibility of launching its own attack if things went well. But Field Marshals Walter Model and Gerd von Rundstedt, who were in charge of the operation, had serious concerns. Hitler wouldn't hear of them.
There were a number of problems they saw with the plan for the Ardennes offensive. The first one was that they thought the German troops were simply not strong enough. Germany had assembled pretty much the last reserves, you might say, for this big offensive, but they were still being outnumbered by the Allies. Second thing was that logistics was not really on the German side. The Germans actually, in their plans, made sure and pointed out that they would have to capture Allied petrol depots in order to keep the German tanks rolling.
Fuel was a major part of the German supply problem in the latter part of the Second World War. The major issue was that the Russians had now overrun the Romanian oil fields. Germany had barely enough fuel to keep her tanks running and her planes in the air.
If the Germans were to achieve any success, the High Command knew they would need complete surprise and hoped the winter weather would be on their side, negating the Allies' overwhelming air superiority. But above all, they needed to reach objectives quickly before the enemy could organize their response and bring in enough reinforcements to halt the advance. The main thrust would be under the command of one of Hitler's most trusted officers, Sepp Dietrich. Josef Sepp Dietrich was a staunch Hitler loyalist who held the most senior military rank in the SS. In the early days, this decorated World War I veteran had been Hitler's chauffeur and bodyguard, and participated in the purge of the Nazi Party, known as the Night of the Long Knives, in 1934. He enjoyed the Führer's complete trust. For his exploits as a corps commander in Normandy, Hitler awarded diamonds to Dietrich's Knight's Cross, Nazi Germany's highest decoration. But his lack of education or training created problems at higher command. It was said he was unable to read a military map. German morale was high. Recent successes against the Allied advance had been dubbed the miracle in the West. Some even believed the tide of the war might be about to turn.
Da hat man wirklich das Gefühl, ja, haben wir den Glauben, jetzt geht's noch mal nach vorn, jetzt gewinnen wir, können wir doch noch mal den Krieg gewinnen.
Planning and preparation was meticulous, and the build-up went ahead with every precaution for maintaining secrecy. The Germans minimized the use of telephone landlines and forbade the use of wireless transmissions that might be intercepted. Freezing fog prevented the Allies carrying out air reconnaissance. As a result, the Allies were virtually blind to the German buildup. The ground froze hard, making it excellent going for heavy German tanks on the move. It was the moment they had been waiting for. On the 16th of December 1944, at 5:30 a.m., 1,600 German artillery guns opened fire.
Das war ein unablässiges Dröhnen, Heulen, Orgeln von Granaten, von Raketenwerfern. Es war eine Qualmwand, die da aufstieg, und darin zuckten die Detonationsblitze auf in verschiedenen Farben. Also es war ein schaurig schönes Inferno.
90 minutes later, the Germans attacked US positions along a 40-mile front.
Also sowas hatte ich vorher noch nie erlebt. Da war ja noch mal alles an Panzern und was wir hatten, die neuesten Panzer, Artillerie zusammengezogen. Die Amerikaner waren ja völlig überrascht. Die haben zum Teil, stand der heiße Kaffee noch in Kannen am Tisch und der Frühstücksspeck und Rühreier. So sind die gelaufen, die waren ja völlig überrascht.
US 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions suddenly found themselves in the path of the German spearhead, Kampfgruppe Piper, commanded by an officer who represented everything the SS stood for. Only 29 years old, Joachim Piper was a dedicated Nazi who turned 18 the day Hitler came to power and secured a place in Sepp Dietrich's elite Leibstandarte SS division in 1936. He was close to many of the Nazi hierarchy and had served on the personal staff of Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, second only to Hitler himself. But Piper was no desk jockey. His combat record earned him a reputation as a bold and aggressive leader, the admiration of his men, and Germany's highest military decoration, the Knight's Cross. He was also linked to many atrocities committed by the division against civilians and prisoners of war. Piper's unit became known as the Blowtorch Battalion, a nickname that was said to come from the slaughter and burning of Soviet villages. The coming days would only add to Piper's savage reputation. Piper's battle group was 600 vehicles and 5,000 men strong, including a detachment of formidable King Tiger tanks.
Despite the impressive nature of the Tiger I, the German military stops making them in the summer of 1944, and they move on to an even more impressive beast, the King Tiger or Royal Tiger, Tiger II. And that's built because Hitler insists that the newer 88mm gun, which is even longer, even more powerful, is put on a tank chassis. For the Ardennes attack, one of the biggest problems the Germans faced was logistics. Keeping tanks like this King Tiger on the road was a real problem. The supplies, keeping them moving forward, despite the fact that the Germans had stockpiled fuel, Albert Speer, the armaments minister, sees these stockpiles are still at some of the railheads. They haven't moved forward to the frontline troops.
To protect such valuable vehicles in the opening stages of the battle, infantry were pushed forward to clear the way for the tanks. The first place enemy resistance was expected was the tiny Belgian village of Lanzarat on the edge of the Ardennes Forest. Piper held his tanks back, while German infantry secured the area. Lanzarat's tiny American garrison was hopelessly outnumbered, but opened fire on the approaching German troops.
The German troops withdraw, and they start basically digging in, and they stay in their positions for several hours.
12 hours later, and behind schedule, Piper and his tank column arrived on the scene.
At that point, Piper gets very angry and he pushes forward with his battle group to find that the Americans have withdrawn several hours earlier and that the wood had been empty and no Americans have been there for quite some time. So this episode throws into turmoil the German plan for the advance.
After the costly delay at Lanzerat, Piper's armoured column made rapid progress, and a few kilometres further on at Honsfeld, they ran into one of the 99th Division's rest centres, full of bewildered American troops, many of whom were soon taken prisoner. Then he made a detour north, to Bullingen.
At Bullingen, Kampfgruppe Piper, under the command of Joachim Piper, captured a large Allied fuel depot, which made it possible for this particular unit and subsequent units to continue their advance.
Here, Piper's column also found use for the captured American soldiers.
They suddenly realized that they have Allied fighter planes overhead. And what would normally happen is that these would now engage and start strafing the German tank column. So the Germans take a number of the American prisoners that they have and basically use them as human shields and put them in front of their vehicles to prevent the Americans from attacking. And this is exactly what happens. So the account that we have is that the American pilots in frustration are circling over the German formation but do not engage. And Kampfgruppe Piper manages to get away.
Piper continued his advance west, unaware that if he had turned north, he had an opportunity to flank and trap the entire US 2nd and 99th Divisions. Later that day, his force ran into a US artillery unit at Bastogne. The American column of 26 vehicles was hopelessly outgunned and had no choice but to surrender. The men were taken into a nearby field, along with other POWs that had been captured earlier.
Everybody was lined up in the field then. And the German soldiers were coming by, half-tracks and vehicles, and after that, the foot soldiers were coming by too.
The prisoners suddenly found their captors were covering them with machine guns, which then opened fire.
I got hit in both legs then with the machine gun fire. And they started coming through, and anybody would holler or say something, they shoot them, laying there. I said, good God, I hope they miss me. And they did.
While some, like Albert Valenci, had a lucky escape in the chaos, at least 84 out of 125 prisoners were killed. Many later found to have been finished off by a shot to the head or a rifle butt. The Malmedy massacre was the largest single massacre of prisoners by Piper's men in the Ardennes campaign, but not the last.
The way I think that they were on a timetable, that's the only thing I could think. They didn't have time to be fooling around with prisoners or anybody. That's the only thing I can think, is they were in a big hurry.
The Waffen-SS, who in some cases regarded what other people saw as war crimes as part of their style of warfare, and this shows up very clearly in the Battle of the Bulge. The actual orders given are that prisoners should not be allowed to delay the advance. And German army units largely interpret this to mean disarm prisoners and tell them to march east, possibly under an escort, but don't spend any time trying to do too much with them. The Waffen-SS interpretation is that prisoners are to be shot.
Word of the massacre quickly spread among Allied forces. Some American troops took matters into their own hands, carrying out reprisals against German SS prisoners. Many decided that now they'd rather fight on to the end than risk being taken prisoner. The very next day, Piper's column would commit an even greater atrocity, this time upon unarmed civilians at the village of Stavelot. At dawn on the 18th of December, Piper's armored column attacked a US anti-tank unit, driving them out of Stavelot. They rolled into a village that was now undefended, leaving only the villagers.
Toute la colonne de Piper est passée devant ma maison. Il y avait des gros chars, des half-track, comme on dit en anglais, et les panzergrenadiers suivaient, mais on n'osait pas se montrer. On avait réellement peur.
Piper's column opened fire on the villagers.
Maman crie en allemand, elle dit, écoutez, nous sommes des civils. Mais malgré tout, ils ont tiré. Donc ils sont revenus une deuxième fois, ils ont encore retiré parce que ça bougeait encore un peu. Donc maman a été tuée, mes deux sœurs.
A few days later, US forces entered the town and found horrific scenes.
In the first house I went into, an elderly couple, a man and a woman, they were real old, and they were lying in the floor in a pool of blood. And the blood was frozen, and I looked at them and examined them. They had been shot through the head, and their throats were cut. So it was frozen blood, and I was very shocked to see this. There was a woman in there who didn't have any clothes on, and her left arm was hacked off. And there was a baby in there that was dead. And every house that I went to was just like that over and over.
Piper's SS added to their grim record, murdering more than 100 Belgian civilians in and around Stavelot. The Allies had worked out that the Germans were relying on captured fuel to keep their vehicles moving. So they hurriedly began to destroy all the fuel dumps that lay in the path of the German advance. While Piper, moving west out of Stavelot, completely missed the main American fuel dump just north of the village. Piper's progress depended on events on the Elsenborn Ridge, a line on the north shoulder of the battle.
The key for Piper and his advance is if he can make sure that not only is he pushing forward, but that his lines of supply and reinforcement are protected. And the problem is that those lines are dominated by a geographic feature called the Elsenborn Ridge, which is held by American units. There's a German force that is tasked with knocking the Americans off of that, the 12th SS Panzer Division. And this is really the key to whether Piper can keep going. If the 12th can knock the Americans off of there, Piper's got a much better chance of making a deep penetration. If they can't, then his advance is going to stall out even before it started.
But the 12th SS Panzer, supported by the 506th Heavy Tank Battalion, were in difficulty, held up at the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherat. It was an intense battle that was costing them dearly in blood, tanks, and time. All that day and into the night, the battle raged, with SS tank and assault guns hitting the villages from the east, supported by a barrage of Nebelwerfer rockets. While from the west came a hailstorm of American artillery shells, fitted with special fuses.
One thing that we had that was superior to Germany, we had a proximity fuse on our artillery pieces. Proximity fuse was a device. If you wanted the artillery to explode 100 feet above ground, 200 feet or whatever distance above ground, you could set it and it would explode without ground contact. Germans had nothing like that.
American artillery threw back repeated German infantry assaults, while howitzers and anti-tank teams took out German panzers. US forces withdrew to positions on the Elsenborn Ridge and dug in along a new defensive line. They had no intention of yielding more ground to the German advance. But US troops found their entrenching tools hardly made an impression on the frozen ground, leading to a drastic new approach.
They gave us quarter-pound blocks of TNT. The engineers had little blocks of TNT, and they finally wised up that there was no way we could dig through this frozen tundra. So they issued us these blocks of TNT, and we'd put them in the ground, and they would slowly blow the hole open and get the top part off. Then you could sort of dig a little bit. But that's the only way we got the foxhole dug.
Piper's spearhead, meanwhile, had run into fierce resistance as US engineers blew up bridges in front of and behind him. Not only threatened with being cut off from supply and reinforcement, German troops knew they'd be sitting ducks for Allied aircraft as soon as the clouds cleared. One American spotter plane managed to fly under the cloud cover and locate his column, directing fighter bombers to the attack. Piper's battle group could advance no further and was forced onto the defensive. Just 3 days into Hitler's offensive, the stubborn resistance of a mixed bag of US units had frustrated Hitler's main hope for the battle.
We had a lot of casualties from artillery and everything, but we didn't go out on combat patrols. We had none of this going out beyond the line. We just sat where we were, you know, held the line.
With Piper bottled in, all hopes of achieving a breakthrough now hinged on Hitler's other major strike force, the 5th Panzer Army. Attacking simultaneously with Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army in the north, the offensive here offered a real chance of German success. Their objectives included the towns of Saint-Vith and Bastogne, and ultimately the Belgian capital, Brussels. On the night of the attack, the Germans bounced searchlight beams off the clouds to create artificial moonlight for the advance. A brief artillery barrage further warned the Allies that an attack was on its way. In command was one of Germany's best panzer generals. Nicknamed Kleiner, Little One, because of his short stature, General Hasse von Manteuffel was a highly decorated and skillful commander, arguably the best of the German generals involved in the Ardennes Offensive. As an early exponent of armored warfare, he had his own ideas on how best to achieve a breakthrough, and was skeptical of Sepp Dietrich's plan to attack along a narrow corridor. He had decided that his 5th Panzer Army would instead attack on a broad front, on the basis that, as he put it, if we knock on 10 doors, we will find several open. Standing in the path of the 5th Panzer Army's advance were 2 thinly spread US infantry divisions, the 28th and the inexperienced 106th.
The initial response of the American commanders in the area, people like Bradley and Eisenhower, was that this was just a minor counterattack, straightening of the lines, or something local that the Germans were doing. They didn't think that the Germans were capable of or wanted to mount a counteroffensive in the Ardennes. And so, among other things, they had actually put second-line troops in that sector, troops in need of rest, inexperienced divisions.
US 28th Division were veterans of the battle for Hürtgen Forest, where they'd suffered heavy losses. They'd been sent to the Ardennes to rest and rebuild, but their respite would be short-lived. One 10-mile stretch of front was held by just 2 battalions, 2,000 men, about to face 31,000 Germans, along the main road to the strategically vital town of Bastogne. Whole regiments found themselves isolated by the advancing German forces. And to sow further confusion among US troops, the Germans had launched a clandestine operation codenamed Greif. It was headed by legendary German commando Otto Skorzeny, seen here being interrogated by his American captors after the war. Operation Greif involved disguising English-speaking Germans in American uniforms, even riding in captured Allied vehicles. Dubbed Panzer Brigade 150, Their objective was to cause as much havoc as possible, cutting cables, moving road signs and minefield warnings, and gathering intelligence.
Wir saßen im Jeep, Kaugummi essen, nicht amerikanische Zigaretten. Ich habe mit einem gesprochen, hat auch englische Zeitungen oder amerikanische. Was macht ihr? Ja, die waren auch ziemlich verschwiegen. Die haben sich nur gegrenzt.
So there was a lot of infiltration going on. And as that word got around that we were being infiltrated, any little sound that you heard, you just automatically assumed it was somebody sneaking up on you. So the nervousness increased quite a bit.
Very, very few of them actually could stand a check. And of course, Americans had a terrible time asking each other trick questions about who's Betty Grable's husband, or what's a Texas Liga. It's a baseball term, by the way.
They knew about Lou Gehrig, and they knew about the Yankees and the Giants, and many of them had lived in the United States at one time. So they were able to get by, and then the troops behind them were accepted. If they had similar kind of equipment, even though they didn't speak English, they could get by.
One way you could spot these men was that they were so short of equipment that they would drive with 4 people in a jeep. The Americans had so many jeeps, if they had 4 men, they used 2 jeeps, 3 was the maximum. Probably the most important effect was that General Eisenhower was in effect imprisoned by his own staff in his headquarters, because they were afraid that these men were going to drive all the way to Paris and Versailles, perhaps, and try and assassinate him. And Eisenhower eventually got fed up with this and announced that somebody could shoot him if they wanted to, but he was going to get out and find out about the battle.
This paranoia caused by Skorzeni's men translated into a hard attitude towards some German prisoners.
We wanted to know where more of the Germans in American uniforms were, because that was necessary to save our skins, if you know what I mean. We said we will give him 5 seconds to answer the question. And if he didn't, we was gonna blow his brains out. And in some cases, we blew his brains out. I said, you know, after that, we had no problem at all getting all the answers we wanted.
Most of the German infiltrators were soon caught and faced only one possible sentence.
Ich möchte sagen, es war ja für die Jungs ein Himmelfahrtskommando. Wäre wahrscheinlich auch nicht anders gewesen, wenn wir Amerikaner in deutschen Uniformen erwischt hätten, die da so allerhand angestellt haben.
I needed that information to save the people in my platoon, as well as my battalion. And I had no hesitation. And I'd seen what they've done to us and what they did to our people in Normandy, especially. I had no sympathy for any of them.
Events were moving quickly, but not quickly enough for the Germans. Saint-Vith was a key crossroads on the boundary between Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army and Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army. The Germans had planned to take it on the 2nd day, but it held out for 5. With so many armoured vehicles, horse-drawn artillery and troops moving along the forest roads, traffic jams also began to slow down the German advance and prevent much-needed supplies reaching forward units. To ease congestion on the roads, the Germans needed to take control of the crossroads at Bastogne, and Manteuffel's forces were heading straight for it. Allied commanders scrambled for any means to slow down the German advance on Bastogne. Reserves were rushed forward, among them the famous 82nd and 101st US Airborne Divisions, hard-bitten veterans of D-Day and Operation Market Garden.
A runner came down to where I was in one of the barracks there, and he says, the colonel wants to see you right away. Well, he didn't have to tell me which colonel. I knew which colonel is my battalion commander. So I took off up the road. I knew something was serious. And he says, we are moving out as soon as we can load the trucks, which are coming in now, and going to town called Bastogne, because we got to get there before the Germans do and stop the railroad, stop the highways.
Some paratroopers were on their way to Paris for some R&R after 72 days on the line in Holland.
The military police picked us up 12 miles outside of Reims while we were heading to Paris. Said we had to come back to get on trucks to go somewhere where we didn't know. Nobody knew where we were going to go.
So sure enough, we got on these trucks, rode for 2 or 3 days, and dismounted just south of the town of Bastogne. And nobody knew what the situation was. If there was, they weren't going to tell. And we double-timed about 10 or 12 miles through the town of Bastogne and took up a perimeter position.
This hurried deployment would have a crucial impact on the outcome of the battle.
Once the Allied High Command realized that this was a substantial German attack, Eisenhower gathered his main commanders, Montgomery and Bradley and Patton, among others, at a meeting to start strategizing about how to react.
The American forces standing in the path of the German offensive belonged to the US First Army, commanded by General Courtney Hodges. To the north was British 21st Army Group, commanded by Field Marshal Montgomery. To their south was the US Third Army, under General Patton.
The decision was that Montgomery would turn his forces southward to attack the northern edge of the German salient, and that Patton would turn his forces northward against the southern edge of the salient and both relieve American defenders but also pinch off the bulge that the Germans had created. And when Eisenhower asked Montgomery how long it would take him to get moving, Montgomery, who was normally obviously a very cautious guy, said about 2 weeks to turn his forces and head southward. When Eisenhower turned to Patton and asked the same question, Patton said 48 hours. And Montgomery chided him. George, you can't do that. You know you can't do that. And Patton said 48 hours. And so Eisenhower said, okay, I don't believe you, but okay. And Patton confessed to Bradley that he had actually started the Third Army moving northward, turning towards the attack even before the meeting with Eisenhower, because he was pretty sure what Eisenhower was going to ask him to do. And that's one of the aggressive, self-confident things that really made the legend of George Patton.
A week before Christmas 1944, the US 101st Airborne arrived in Bastogne to shore up the line. Not a moment too soon.
Refugees were coming in to Bastogne from the way I was going, and I knew what that meant. The Germans weren't very far behind.
As the 101st arrived in Bastogne, rumors spread among the troops that they were already cut off. The Germans had surrounded the town.
We were cut off, and our whole medical company that was on the tail end of our command was cut off. They were captured, the whole command.
Oh, it went from bad to worse. When we arrived at Bastogne, there was no snow on the ground at all. The next night, it started snowing. It snowed before it stopped about knee-deep.
In these freezing conditions, the 101st Airborne would have to hold out with dwindling supplies and buy the Allies desperately needed time. US paratroopers were sent to Bastogne in such a rush, little thought was given to winter clothing or the freezing conditions they'd encounter.
17 degrees below zero. We had no shelter whatsoever, except foxholes. We had almost nothing. I mean, absolutely nothing. We had no overcoats. We had no overshoes. We had no gloves. That's where we got into Bastogne.
In the winter of 1944-45, the American army find themselves fighting the Battle of the Bulge, hopelessly unprepared for weather, which was well below zero. Most of the men were still wearing their 1943 pattern combat jackets, which had been excellent for fighting throughout the summer months, but were just not up to the job for the winter. The men were issued with greatcoats, but again, once these were soaking wet, sitting in foxholes and having to sleep in them at night, and you're freezing cold, all of this just helped add to the misery. And despite being issued with scarves and gloves and woolen jumpers, it just wasn't enough in conditions which were almost minus 18 degrees. The entrenching tools that they were issued were worse than useless. Even picks and shovels were making no impression on ground which was just like concrete at this time of year. Whenever possible, American soldiers would take clothing items from dead or wounded German soldiers or prisoners of war, because the Germans had been fighting on the Russian front in the east for the last few years, and the Germans by then knew a thing or two about winter clothing.
In the worst winter weather in living memory, Bastogne's defenders, without hope of resupply or tactical support from the air, were on their own. They were outnumbered approximately 5 to 1, and lacking not only cold weather gear, but also food and medical supplies. They had some artillery, but very little ammunition. Among the defenders were the 333rd Field Artillery Regiment, an African-American combat unit. 11 of its soldiers had been cut off during the retreat to Bastogne, captured, tortured, and murdered by the SS. The commander of the 47th Panzer Corps, Heinrich von Ludwitz, ordered his infantry to attack Bastogne with half the tanks of the Panzer Lehr division, while the rest bypassed the town and continued the advance westwards. In a further sign of Ludwitz's confidence, on the 22nd of December, he sent a message to the US commander in Bastogne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, demanding his surrender. He wrote, "There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. In order to think it over, a term of 2 hours will be granted, beginning with the presentation of this note. If this proposal should be rejected, 1 German artillery corps and 6 heavy AA battalions are ready to annihilate the USA troops in and near Bastogne. The order for firing will be given immediately after this 2 hours term." In a Battle of the Bulge legend, McAuliffe simply replied, "Nuts." The airborne units around the perimeter were subject to repeated and determined attacks by German infantry and armor. But despite the cold, lack of supplies and shortage of ammunition, the defenders of Bastogne continued to hold out. In a few cases, the extreme cold could be a lifesaver.
All of a sudden, out of a clear blue sky, apparently a mortar shell had a tree burst on this tree we were under. A few seconds after the tree burst, Stein said to me, "Are you hit?" And I said to him, "No, I don't think so." I said, "Are you hit?" He said, "I don't feel I was hit, but I feel this stuff. Give me your hand." And he gave me my hand, and I felt this blood on his leg. And sure as hell, he was hit, and it was gushing. A piece of shrapnel had severed his artery in his leg. And it was so cold that the blood was very slow oozing out of him, saved his life.
Frank Gregg was also hit.
I was standing in the window with my field glasses looking out to try to see where this firing was coming from. And while I was standing there, a shell hit the windowsill, blew me about halfway across the room. And my right eye was, the medics bandaged it up as quickly as they could, because they thought I was going to lose the eye. We held on, And then the Germans attacked again and again, but not at my position. If the Germans had attacked in 2 places at one time, they would have run all over us. But they attacked in a single place each time, and we managed to stop them. Since it was only one place, we'd take troops from over here and put them over there.
For the first week of the German offensive, heavy winter cloud cover had denied the Allies use of one of their greatest assets, air support. Finally, on the 23rd of December, the skies over Bastogne cleared. Allied air forces were able to drop ammunition, medical supplies, and food to the besieged defenders.
We got a break in the weather, and some C-47s came in and threw out some bundles of ammo, and we got the ammunition in and distributed, and then there was a little food, and they had about, I guess there must have been 5 medical officers came in and parachuted in and sent them to the aid station, and they started working on the aid, on the people who had been wounded, our people. And I was glad I did, because 2 days later, I was back there myself.
By the 23rd, the Germans had seized the crucial crossroads at Saint-Vite, and some units had managed to advance as far as the River Meuse. But the battle was now starting to turn against them.
While units of the German army had made it to the Meuse, they hadn't made it in any kind of strength. And there was no ability for them to actually get over the river, either in terms of numbers or in terms of the supplies and fuel that they had. And while St. Vith had fallen, the American forces had only dropped back as far as the nearest geographic feature behind it, a ridge behind St. Vith itself, making the town much less useful as a way of getting forces forward.
Meanwhile, Kampfgruppe Piper had been cut off for 4 days and had had to abandon their tanks. The survivors were now trying to make their way back through the forests to the German lines. Patton's Third Army was now fighting its way towards Bastogne from the south, making a deep inroad into the bulge, or salient, created in the Allied lines by the German advance, the bulge that later gave its name to the battle.
The classic way to deal with the kind of salient, the kind of bulge that ended up after the German offensive had taken place, is actually not to push it back from its farthest reach, it's to pinch off the shoulders. That is, to try to cut the neck of the salient and force the German forces within that to surrender.
On the 26th of December 1944, Patton's armies broke through to the villages around Bastogne. The following day, a corridor was opened to get supplies and reinforcements in and casualties out of the town itself. The week-long siege of Bastogne was over.
You understand, the 101st, we were glad to be relieved at Bastogne. I was down to my last box of ammunition. We had no food, and we were hurting, but we were a cohesive unit. We were relieved and not rescued, because as soon as we were refitted with ammunition, food, and got new weapons and so forth, we moved out into to cut off the German salient. And that's where we had our killing time so much, in the Beaujolais Wood, where we cut them off.
Despite mounting evidence that the battle was lost, Hitler ordered German soldiers to continue their attacks. He had one last wild gamble to make before he was prepared to call off the offensive. On New Year's Day 1945, in a desperate effort to regain the initiative, Germany's depleted Luftwaffe launched a large-scale surprise attack on Allied airfields in Belgium and Holland. The Allies, caught off guard, lost 276 aircraft damaged or destroyed, but 304 German aircraft were destroyed, effectively wiping out the Luftwaffe. A few days later, Hitler called off the offensive, ordering the withdrawal of German forces from the Ardennes, including the few remaining SS Panzer divisions. But fighting continued for another 3 weeks. Throughout January, Allied counterattacks from the north and south pushed the Germans back, and vital crossroads were recaptured. By January the 25th, the Battle of the Bulge was over. Allied victory came at a high cost. The number of American casualties has been estimated at 75,000, with 29,000 killed or missing, making it the deadliest battle fought by the US Army in World War II.
A lot of the people who were wounded because of the cold died before they could be attended to. In other words, you go into shock and you freeze to death.
Sub-zero temperatures added to the suffering on all sides, with numerous cases of frostbite and trench foot.
Hospitals were filled with GIs with frozen feet. And when you get trench foot, they just amputate.
German casualties numbered between 67,000 and 98,000, with at least 34,000 killed or missing. They lost more than 600 tanks and assault guns, and the Luftwaffe was now a spent force. In contrast to the Allies, these were losses that Germany could not replace.
With the failure of the Ardennes Forest, even any kind of negotiated peace was clearly off the table. And the German government began to think about how the war was going to end and whether unconditional surrender was the best possible way to go. It's at this point that Hitler really begins to descend more into fantasy. He doesn't want to concede that the war is lost, and so he begins to really become delusional about what's going on.
Hitler's last desperate throw of the dice in the war in the West had failed. Now, with the Russians moving into central Germany, the Nazis were getting ready to make their last stand. March 1945. 9 months on from D-Day, the Western Allies had reached the last great natural barrier between them and the German heartland, the Rhine River.
Psychologically, it was very important. The die is really cast. We're getting into the heartland of the Third Reich.
This was where the Wehrmacht planned to make its last great stand in the West.
Das kommt alles zusammen. Das ist dann eine Mischung aus Vaterland, aus Eid, aus Pflichtbewusstsein, aus Beharrungsvermögen, wie sie es nehmen wollen.
While Allied soldiers lived in desperate fear of being killed, with the end in sight.
You knew you had to still be prepared to lay down your life, but you weren't quite so keen to do it as you had been earlier on because the war was going to be over.
This is the story of the battle for the Rhine. In January 1945, Hitler's last offensive in the West, known as the Battle of the Bulge, had ended in catastrophic defeat. In its wake, the Allies were able to fight their way through the Siegfred line fortifications that defended Germany's frontier from invasion. In the east, Stalin's Red Army was just 50 miles from Berlin. To most, Nazi Germany's defeat seemed inevitable, merely a matter of time. But not all Germans were ready to give up.
They're now fighting on German soil. So they're defending their own homes, their families, their own territory against the invader. Another reason is fanaticism. particularly amongst the younger ones that are now getting drafted into the army, so the 16, 17-year-olds, because these are people, or young people, who've only known the Nazi state, who've only known Nazi propaganda. So to them, slogans like, Germany must live even if we die, you are nothing, your people is everything, actually do mean something. So they are quite willing to sacrifice themselves.
Adolf Hitler hoped that the River Rhine, the last great natural barrier between the Western Allies and the German heartland, could be used to inflict a crushing defeat on British and American forces, transforming the strategic situation.
Hitler's still fighting on out of a mixture of calculation and delusion. The calculation is that if the Germans can hold the Western Allies at the Rhine, they can potentially split apart this kind of awkward alliance between the Western democracies and the Soviet communists. But there's also a strong sense of delusion in what Hitler's thinking. He's fantasizing about units that got destroyed months ago. He's trying to organize things that simply aren't going to work. He's refusing any kind of thought about surrender or about peace.
The Allied Supreme Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, knew full well that the Germans would mount fierce resistance along the Rhine. Not just a formidable natural barrier, but a hugely important symbolic frontier for the German people.
Die Rheinromantik spielte eine große Rolle. Es war eine nationale Katastrophe im Bewusstsein vieler, wenn es dem Feind gelang, den Rhein zu überschreiten. Denn dann fragte man sich, wo sollte denn dann wohl noch die Möglichkeit bestehen, sich zu widersetzen, wenn nicht hier.
In the spring of 1945, Eisenhower commanded one of the most powerful armies ever assembled. By March, its 3 army groups had entered Germany and reached the banks of the Rhine. All were now vying with each other to be the first across. In the north was 21st Army Group under British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, comprising 1st Canadian Army, British 2nd Army, and US 9th Army. In the center, US General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group, with US 1st and 3rd Armies. And further south, General Devers' 6th Army Group, with US 7th and French 1st Army. Since the breakout from Normandy, Eisenhower had wrestled with 2 competing strategic options.
One of them was what was called the narrow front or knife thrust approach, which was to pour all the resources he had into a very narrow assault towards Germany and towards the Rhine River. The other was what was called the broad front strategy, which was to parcel out his resources and men among all of his armies and all of his units and advance in an extremely broad front across the whole of Western Europe towards Germany. Eisenhower ended up choosing the broad front and having everybody advance at the same time. Sometimes not to the liking of his best generals. Both Patton and Montgomery were very strongly in favor of a knife thrust, although they differed, unsurprisingly, about who should be the one to carry that out.
Each army group was given the freedom to organize and pursue its own approach to crossing the Rhine, and did so according to form. Montgomery began planning a giant set-piece operation to get 21st Army Group across the river, involving airborne drops and huge amounts of artillery and engineering support. Further south, Patton would rely on speed and initiative to get 3rd Army across wherever an opportunity arose. The Allied dream was to capture a major bridge over the Rhine intact, but it was thought to be a huge long shot. The Germans could be relied on to blow every bridge as soon as they'd retreated across the river.
The Germans were desperate to destroy the bridges over the Rhine because once the Allies crossed the Rhine, it would be very, very hard to stop them because the Allies would be able to use the still existent and still usable infrastructure that the Germans had, including, for example, the motorways, the autobahns. So this really was the last line of defense that the Germans could expect, perhaps, to hold against the Allies in the West.
But a bit of luck and American improvisation was about to hand Bradley's 12th Army Group one of the greatest opportunities of the war, at a town called Remagen. On the 7th of March, scouts of the US 9th Armored Division arrived on a hill overlooking Remagen. They were stunned to see the 350-meter-long Ludendorff Bridge still intact. Here was a chance for the Allies to leap the Rhine in a single bound. But the town of Remagen and the bridge itself was crowded with retreating German soldiers, refugees, and vehicles.
And I can remember seeing people running, soldiers and civilians going across the bridge, German soldiers and German civilians crossing the bridge, and at the other side of it, it was a high hill, and the railroad track went through a tunnel. And so it was a good view of that from where we were over there.
General William Hogue, commander of Combat Command B of the 9th Armored Division, arrived on the scene. An experienced engineer officer, veteran of D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge, he quickly took charge of the operation to seize Remagen and rush the Ludendorff Bridge before the Germans could destroy it. Fortunately, his division could call on the newest model of American tank, a much-needed replacement for the iconic but vulnerable M4 Sherman.
The M26 Pershing tank is one of those what might have been stories of World War II. As soon as the Sherman tank went into production, the American military starts designing a replacement vehicle. But the Americans fighting in Europe have a major set of issues. If they start importing different tanks to Europe, bigger tanks, there's going to be transport and logistics issues. So the Pershing actually only gets into production later in 1944. 20 of them are rushed across to Europe as something called the Zebra mission. They're almost being tested out in combat. And this tank suddenly gives the American a real big advantage. It's got this massive 90mm gun on it. The firepower of this is better even than that on the King Tiger. It's got a powerful new engine. It's got wider tracks and thicker armor at the front, so the crews feel safer when they're going into combat.
With Pershing tanks quickly silencing enemy opposition, Remagen was soon taken, and the Americans turned their attention to the bridge. Unknown to the Americans, the Germans had already tried to blow the bridge once, but the explosives had failed to detonate. A second attempt had only damaged it due to a lack of the right explosives.
They ask for 600 kilograms of explosives, but they're only given 300. And they do find out that these 300 are actually of a lower quality than the normal explosives they would have expected. These were from mines, so we're used to blow mines rather than blow up bridges. That's the only bit that explodes, and it leaves the bridge intact.
In the aftermath of the explosion, an American infantry company was ordered forward to take the bridge.
Auf einmal kam ein amerikanischer Soldat von der letzten Straße, die heute noch ist, in Remagen, in Richtung Brücke und ging allein mit seinem Gewehr im halben Anschlag an einer Mauer vorbei, Schritt für Schritt, sichernd, wenn so sein, so 200, 250 Meter und nichts passierte. Das habe ich mir alles angeguckt und dann stand ein erster amerikanischer Panzer direkt neben der Brücke auf der Remagener Seite. Da wusste ich, jetzt Heinrich, wird's Zeit, jetzt musst du abhauen.
A Pershing tank helped to clear a path for the infantry.
The infantry come under fire from machine gun nests that are positioned in the towers either side of the bridge. The Pershing tanks fired back at those towers, knocking out the machine gun positions.
US soldiers venturing onto the bridge knew the Germans might try to blow it again at any minute, and this time succeed. They were joined by 3 Army engineers, led by Lieutenant Hugh Mott. He was later interviewed for Allied newsreels.
After the infantry had taken the town of Remagen, the task force commander, Lieutenant Colonel Engelman, called me up and ordered me out on the bridge to do some reconnaissance. I was to find out what demolitions were on the bridge and if the bridge would take traffic, and if not, how long it would take to repair the bridge for traffic.
Later in life, Mott recalled his feelings, walking onto a bridge that might be blown sky high at any minute.
There wasn't a whole lot of firefighting, really, that first afternoon there. And in fact, the firing was a little firing here and there, and you was asking about a feeling you had. When you went out on that bridge, it just felt like they just laying back there in the shadows saying, come on, baby. Come on across here, and we'll get you and the bridge both at the same time. You know, that's the kind of feeling that you had.
Under nothing more than sporadic sniper fire, the first American squad reached the end of the bridge without a single casualty. Along the way, they and the engineers disabled as many charges as possible.
Some of our friendly engineers from the 9th Armored Division running along the bridge, and when they'd see a wire, they'd reach down and pull it out.
9th Armored Division had crossed the Rhine. Reinforcements were soon on their way.
I received orders to cross the bridge as rapidly as possible. We had some of our infantry across before us, but I was the first complete Allied or friendly company across because I had my cooks with me. The infantry who were with us had their cooks back with the battalion trained behind us, so my company cooked the first hot meal on the far side of the Rhine.
Just 24 hours after the capture of the bridge, local commanders, with Eisenhower's support, had got 8,000 troops across the river. But engineer Frank Cam had concerns about how long the bridge would stay up.
The bridge was obviously damaged. As we went across, there were holes in the bridge, and we dodged around them driving across. And also, as we crossed, I looked up on the right, and I saw on the truss there was a big break in the truss that the Germans had exploded. And I could tell that if that truss were to go all the way, the bridge would collapse. So as soon as we got across the river, I went up to the colonel of the regiment I was supporting, and I said, "Sir, that bridge needs engineer work on it. Do you want me to have my company stay back and work on that bridge? Or do you want me to support our infantry that are forward up here?" He said, "Stay with us." And I said, "That's a good," I felt safer that way.
While American troops fought to enlarge their bridgehead across the Rhine, behind them, engineers worked round the clock to shore up the damaged Ludendorff Bridge. They also set up more crossing points, using landing craft, boats and pontoon bridges to get more troops across the Rhine as quickly as possible. Hitler was furious when he heard that the Allies had captured a Rhine bridge intact. He immediately ordered reinforcements be sent to wipe out the American bridgehead, and the bridge be destroyed at all costs. He also demanded that the officer responsible for it falling into Allied hands was shot.
Man muss sich so vorstellen, dass der Hitler schon jemanden ausgesucht hat, der in seinem Sinne ein Urteil fällen wird. Also man konnte von vornherein davon ausgehen, irgendein Schuldiger, wenn nicht 2, 3, 4, 5 Schuldige, werden gefunden werden.
The man held responsible for the loss of the bridge was Major Hans Scheller. His wife remembers the moment she learned of his fate.
Mittags 2, bei den Nachrichten, den Militärnachrichten. Da wurde es gesagt, dass wegen Feigheit vor dem Feind und Dienstverweigerung hingerichtet worden wäre, verurteilt und hingerichtet worden. Das Urteil wäre bereits vollstreckt.
The Germans were much more aggressive about punishing their own soldiers very harshly. They shot tens of thousands of their own men during the course of World War II. The majority on the Eastern Front, but thousands on the Western Front as well, for offenses ranging from desertion to stealing to rape to cowardice, for all sorts of things. But in comparison to the Allied armies, where only a few, if any, soldiers were executed for crimes of any sort. The Germans were quite willing to shoot their own men and did it tens of thousands of times.
One officer who was not shot, but only sacked, was the German commander in the west, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, a convenient scapegoat for the blunder at Remagen. He was replaced by a defensive specialist with a brilliant record in Italy. Albert Kesselring was a Luftwaffe general who'd won a reputation as a skilled commander of both air and ground troops. His masterful defense of Italy against two Allied armies prompted Hitler to bring him back to Germany to organize its defense against the Western Allies. Able though he was, Kesselring now faced an impossible strategic situation. To try to hold the Allies at the Rhine, Kesselring had at his disposal Army Group H in the Netherlands under General Blaskowitz, Field Marshal Model's Army Group B, and Army Group G in the southwest under General Hausser.
There was a fundamental issue because a lot of the troops that were fighting now on the Western Front were either very old men who hadn't been drafted into the army beforehand, or extremely young people who had now just been drafted out of the Hitler Youth. The core of the German army, the very experienced non-commissioned officers and also officers, most of them had by that stage disappeared. So the army as a fighting organization is actually is not performing particularly well because they don't have the right manpower, they don't have the right training, and also they don't have enough of the needed material and the equipment.
Kesselring's first priority was to eradicate the American toehold across the Rhine at Remagen. The Americans had moved thousands of reinforcements into the bridgehead, using the Ludendorff Bridge itself, as well as pontoon bridges their engineers had built alongside it. The Germans now mounted a series of increasingly daring attempts to destroy them.
Everything they had, they threw at it, trying to bring the bridge down. They use air power, and they use some of the very latest planes that they have.
These included the world's first operational jet bomber, the Arado 234 Blitz. With a top speed around 460 miles per hour, the Blitz could outrun Allied fighters and ground fire to deliver its 1.5-ton payload. The jets flew 9 sorties over 6 days, but never hit their target. To protect their prized crossings, US First Army assembled the greatest concentration of anti-aircraft guns seen in the entire war, nearly 700, as well as fighter cover. US forces claimed to shoot down more than 200 of the 367 aircraft sent to attack the bridge. With the Luftwaffe unable to get through, the Germans brought up a Karl Gereit 540mm mortar, of a type seen here, to shell the bridge. It missed its target 14 times before breaking down. So it was time to unleash one of Hitler's terrifying new wonder weapons.
Hitler then orders the rocket V2 to be launched and fired at the bridge, which really concerns and surprises a lot of the German military because they know that the accuracy is quite low. So they fire 11 of them in total. They all miss. The only thing they do hit is a number of German towns, killing German civilians. But again, the bridge remains intact.
Finally, Otto Skorzeny, the legendary head of a shadowy SS Special Forces unit, dispatched 7 Waffen-SS frogmen downriver with explosives to blow up one of the pontoon bridges. But the Allies had a secret weapon of their own.
This is the Canal Defence Light. It was given that name because it was a secret project. The idea was that in a barbette, or like a turret on the top there would be a carbon arc light in there, which puts out about 13 million candle power. And they could actually set off a shutter that would flash across the light once or twice every second. And that would lead to almost blinding the person who was looking back at it.
The canal defense line on the American side did play a very important role in preventing the bridge from being blown up, because they spotted the frogmen as they were approaching. Having said that, it's a combination of factors really that resulted in the frogmen not being successful. And in addition to the searchlights, it's also the simple fact that these frogmen were exhausted and extremely cold, so not really able to react particularly rapidly to new situations and to being caught in the searchlight.
The SS Frogmen never stood a chance in the freezing river. All were either killed or captured. 10 days after its capture, in the middle of the afternoon on the 17th of March, Ludendorff Bridge collapsed. The German demolition charges, the strain of constant use by heavy vehicles, and near misses from German bombs and shells had finally taken their toll. 28 US Army engineers were killed in the collapse. Men who had been working on the bridge to make it safe until the last minute. Dozens more had to be pulled from the river, many with serious injuries. By the time the bridge collapsed, the Americans had got 25,000 men over the Rhine at Remagen, using the Ludendorff Bridge, pontoon bridges, ferries and landing craft. And on the far shore, they'd carved out a bridgehead 25 miles wide and 8 miles deep. But to bring their full might to bear on Germany's defences, the Allies would have to find more places to cross the Rhine.
It was one bridge, and the Allies couldn't get all of their forces across a single span over the Rhine. With the broad front strategy that Eisenhower was following, the Allies didn't need just one bridge, they needed lots of bridges and lots of ways across the Rhine to get all of their forces over.
About 80 miles north of Remagen, the British 21st Army Group under Field Marshal Montgomery was preparing its own Rhine crossing near Wiesel. But here, the Germans had successfully blown up rail and road bridges in time. So Monty had come up with Operation Plunder, the largest British-led operation since D-Day, involving more than 1.2 million men. While Monty didn't have a bridge, he did have a very powerful and experienced force. The Rhine crossing would be led by the British Second Army, the strongest army Britain had ever put in the field, alongside 1st Canadian Army, US 9th Army, and the US 18th Airborne Corps.
This was very much a Montgomery-style battle in that he provided as much firepower to cover the assault as possible, and in addition, a further airborne drop. The lesson of Market Garden, which perhaps hadn't needed to be learned, was that airborne forces functioned best when they could link up with ground forces as rapidly as possible.
Operation Plunder and its airborne element, Operation Varsity, was a vast undertaking, requiring 60,000 tons of ammunition, 59,000 engineers, and 30,000 tons of engineering supplies, as well as the transport of hundreds of landing craft and amphibious vehicles to get the assault troops across the Rhine. To Monty's great irritation, a few hours before Plunder was launched, he got news that his arch-rival, General Patton, had beaten him across the Rhine. In the south, near Mainz, his 5th Infantry Division had made an improvised crossing in a mix of assault boats, landing craft and amphibious vehicles. They'd required no assistance from artillery, bombers or airborne troops, all of which Patton's boss, General Bradley, was keen to point out in his communique. But Monty was not to be distracted. Not even by a visit from British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who was determined to witness the historic crossing of the Rhine in person. At dusk on the 23rd of March, 3,500 Allied guns began blasting German positions on the far bank of the Rhine. 3 hours later, Operation Plunder got underway, as troops of the 51st Highland Division plunged into the river aboard their Buffalo amphibious armoured transports.
The idea is that this buffalo would be capable of carrying, as I say, 36 infantry or a load of supplies. With a 3-man crew, we were able to use these quite effectively. The idea being that if you're on a river with a fast-flowing current, you have to aim for the opposite bank at an angle of about 45 degrees, so that when the current catches you, it takes the rear end down with the flow of water, and you are then at right angles to the bank.
One of these pioneering amphibious vehicles is today housed at the UK's Tank Museum.
The Buffalo could take 30 soldiers under some form of protection down the steep banks of the Rhine into that fast-flowing river that's sweeping off towards the sea. It powers them across, and on the far side of the bank, it can release its ramp at the rear and let those soldiers off into the attack. So the attack went in first thing in the morning. 600 buffaloes were used to take about 30 soldiers per trip across the Rhine, up the other side, and some of them sat there and gave covering fire with their Polston cannons.
As we approached the river in these buffaloes, we were all very cheerful. And as we got near to the river, the buffalo was bumping us about a little bit, but it was all prepared and everything was organized, everything was under control. We got to the river and then the buffalo reared up in the air, nosedived down into the river and deep into the river with a small draft separating us. And all of a sudden everything went quiet. And then David Reed started to play his mouth organ. And then the next thing, the boys in the buffalo started to sing. And the cheerful atmosphere, feeling returned. And we went across the Rhine to the accompaniment of the mouth organ and everybody singing in good heart, in good spirits.
As British and American infantry crossed the Rhine in the early morning of the 24th of March, Allied tracer fire and shells streamed overhead to keep German heads down and to mark out landing spots. Trooper Peter Davis was driving one of the buffaloes across the Rhine.
Monty had put down such a tremendous barrage with artillery, as he did with most major attacks, and the barrage over the Rhine was tremendous. And then, of course, the smoke screen was put down and we were given the order to go. And we were loaded up with infantry. We got to the other side. We took the first load straight in and got them out of the bank.
German defenders were outnumbered and outgunned and put up only sporadic resistance in the face of the Allied onslaught. The man responsible for coordinating German defences along this stretch of the Rhine was General Johannes Blaskowitz, commander of Army Group H. He initially had a promising career, but after speaking out against SS atrocities in Poland, he was sidelined for 4 years, finally being given command of German forces in southern France in 1944. An experienced and capable commander, he knew full well that he faced a nearly hopeless task in defending the Rhine frontier. Blaskowitz's Army Group H looked impressive on paper, but most of its divisions were only 3,000 to 4,000 strong, compared to a typical Allied divisional strength of 16,000 men. What's more, his troops were desperately short of artillery and tank support. The entire army group could muster barely 200 tanks and assault guns, against the might of 5 Allied armoured divisions with more than 1,000 tanks.
Most of them had very little in the way of equipment or tanks or vehicles left. German industry had been destroyed for the large part either by occupation or by the strategic bombing. And so the German army in 1945 is really a shadow of its former self, fighting more out of habit, more out of loyalty, more out of a lack of anything else useful to do, and in the desperate hope that maybe Hitler would come up with a wonder weapon that would transform the war, that maybe they could preserve their families and their home societies. but with no real strong hope for the future.
Few German soldiers wanted to die when the end of the war was clearly in sight.
Wir haben gekämpft, aber keine Hoffnung mehr gehabt. Sagen wir so. Nicht mehr gehofft, dass jeder hat gehofft, dass wieder nach Haus kommt, dass nichts mehr passiert. Und so haben wir uns auch verhalten. Also wir waren keine Kämpfer mehr.
With German industry in ruins, priority was given to a cheap, easy-to-produce weapon for taking on Allied tanks.
At the same time as Germany was developing massive tanks like this Jagdtiger, they also developed and produced a number of much simpler weapons, one of which is this Panzerfaust. The idea of the Panzerfaust is it's a hollow charge weapon that they could mass produce. And the idea of a hollow charge weapon, there is a cone of explosive in this head lined with copper. By having a blast charge inside this tube, you aim at an enemy tank about maybe 60 meters away, you press down the ignition charge, that forces this projectile towards the enemy tank. It's a very simple principle. When it hits armor, it explodes and it melts a copper lining that will jet through metal, tends to leave on armor plate about a 2¼ inch hole, and that copper jet goes inside the vehicle and quite often ignites a fire inside. So as a simple weapon, they could mass produce this. By late in 1944, they were making 300,000 of these a month. And the simplicity of it meant they could issue it to Home Guard units, Hitler Youth, all sorts of people could use something as simple as a Panzerfaust.
But despite its crude effectiveness, the Panzerfaust wasn't enough to halt the overwhelming might of the Allied attack.
Wenn Sie die Amerikaner gesehen hätten, mit was für Material die ankamen. Also das war wie, wenn ein reicher Mann gegen einen in 8 Jahre im Gefängnis oder 6 Jahre im Gefängnis sitzenden Halbkranken kämpft.
Against scattered, demoralized defenses, 21st Army Group's crossings went like clockwork. Casualties were light. Some units lost more men to friendly fire than to the enemy. As the morning progressed, the Allies launched more amphibious vehicles and landing craft across the Rhine. By 10 a.m., it was clear to Monty that the landings were going better than anyone could have dared to hope. But the next stage of his plan was the most risky, the massive airborne drop behind German lines, codenamed Operation Varsity. It would be the last and largest airborne operation of the war, bigger than D-Day or Market Garden. The aerial armada would consist of nearly 4,000 transports and gliders, escorted by nearly 900 fighters, and carrying almost 22,000 airborne infantry. At 9:45, Allied artillery fell silent to avoid hitting their own aircraft, and all eyes strained skyward.
It was daytime, 10 o'clock in the morning. That was the H hour. I was the company commander by that time. I had been given command of B Company in the 1st Battalion. And the ride was, again, pretty much like the Normandy ride. People were probably even more confident than they were on the Normandy show.
At first, ground fire from the Germans was light. But as they realized what was happening, more and more guns opened fire. The approaching Allied aircraft were easy targets, slow-moving, flying low, unable to take evasive action during their drop run. The Americans were also about to discover a deadly flaw in the design of their new transport aircraft.
During the actual drop, not in my regiment,
but the sister regiment, Jump Regiment, 513th, lost quite a few flamers, and they were jumping the C-46 that had 2 doors, one on each side. They were jumping both doors out of there. It had fuel systems in it that were much more vulnerable than the C-47.
When punctured, the fuel tanks of the C-46 leaked back into the fuselage, turning some into fireballs. After the paratroopers came the gliders, slower, lower, and even more vulnerable on their approach. In all, nearly 100 Allied transport and glider aircraft were destroyed. Airborne soldiers who made it to the ground scrambled to untangle themselves from parachutes or wrecked gliders, often under fire. The elite airborne units quickly got organized and started to fight back. Within hours, they had seized most of their objectives and were linking up with ground forces who'd crossed the river that morning.
The 6th Airborne Division, they'd landed deep on the gun lines, and I remember joining up with them at about 10 in the morning. But their glider-borne people had terrible casualties. I mean, I don't know how many gliders were shot down in that operation, and an enormous number of men killed. But the rest of the operation went pretty well.
For all its horrors, the airborne drop had been less costly than anticipated, while the river crossings had proved a stunning success. Monty had parts of 4 infantry divisions, as well as amphibious tanks and 2 airborne divisions across the Rhine. General Blaskowitz, now alert to the scale of the Allied operation, committed his only reserves in a desperate battle to save the Reich. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division counterattacked at Ries, while the 116th Panzer Division was ordered to seize back control of the Issel River crossings from Allied paratroopers. But with roving Allied fighter-bombers hitting the German build-up at Issel, as well as fire support from Allied guns on the west bank of the Rhine, the German counterattacks were over almost as soon as they'd begun. Blaskowitz had played his last hand, and all it had achieved was to hold up the Allies for a few hours. Meanwhile, Allied engineers got to work building bridges over the Rhine.
The engineers would build first a bridge that could take individual infantrymen across it. And then they would slowly build it out from there, using pontoons, using steel segments, using all sorts of different equipment to put the bridge together. And so this quite remarkable engineering achievement has kind of been left in the historical shadow, but it was just as critical as the capture at Remagen to how the Allies got across the Rhine River.
When Churchill met Eisenhower on the 25th of March, there was plenty of cause for optimism. The British Prime Minister even crossed the Rhine himself at a quiet sector, spending 30 minutes on the far shore before returning. By the following day, 21st Army Group had 12 bridges in place over the Rhine, and Allied units were beginning to make serious inroads into German territory. German divisions facing the Allied crossing had either been destroyed or were now abandoning their positions to escape the Allied onslaught.
We just went through Germany. That was going like on a coach trip, really, because there wasn't no one there. They would just go, and they knew they'd lost the war, and they just retreated.
Their fighting spirit broken at last, German soldiers began to surrender in ever-increasing numbers.
And we started advancing about 8 to 10 miles a day, capturing hundreds of Germans every day. In fact, there were so many of them that our soldiers would just wave them on the roads and have them go back to the roads without guards sometimes.
I remember one time when we were over the Rhine, and I saw this group of prisoners here, same as everybody else did. There was about 200 of them coming down. They were running like hell. And I thought, cool, that's good. Now, when they got past us, we realised the person driving them on was our little Sergeant Major. And he was going, come on, you buggers, come on, you buggers.
But there were also still many diehards willing to fight to the end for Hitler's Germany. Some were only boys.
There was one young boy, 14-year-old. He held us up. When they found him, well, they couldn't do nothing to him. He's only 14. But he held a whole battalion up, that boy. He got some machine gun or something. He was firing all over the place. We daren't go through. In the end, they found him. And he'd got this machine gun, and he was just firing it anyway.
In just 3 weeks, a mix of American improvisation and Monty's cautious, methodical approach had allowed the Allies to break through Germany's last great natural barrier on a 200-mile front. More crossings of the Rhine quickly followed, from Strasbourg to the Netherlands. Soon, some Allied units were advancing 50 miles a day, infantry catching rides on tanks, German towns decked out in white linen to signify surrender. Eisenhower, to Monty's fury, decided to leave Berlin to the Soviets. But the Nazi Empire was fast crumbling. As Allied units made massive inroads into the German heartland, they uncovered the horrifying crimes committed by the Nazi regime. British troops liberating the concentration camp of Bergen-Belsen found scenes of unimaginable suffering.
We didn't know anything about concentration camps. Never heard of them. Nobody had ever heard of them. What we didn't realize that on one side was the male concentration camp, on the left was the female, that there were a total of 60,000 there, that what we could smell and see were rags all over the place. Rags, they wet rags, they were dead bodies, or dying bodies. And the smell was appalling. And if you concentrated on anything, you see that tree there at the bottom of it, or something, occasionally be a little twitch. That person might not actually be dead.
As Allied soldiers fanned out across Germany, they sometimes came across the palatial homes of Nazi leaders.
Mönchengladbach turned out to house the home of Paul Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister under Adolf Hitler. We captured this area and didn't really know whose it was, except there was a lot of wine and cameras. Goebbels was apparently a big camera and wine collector.
For Jewish soldiers of the 29th Division, an opportunity to celebrate Passover at Goebbels' mansion with survivors of the camps became an act of defiance.
They wanted to go back to that service because that Passover service in the Jewish faith is the story of the Israelites' freedom from Egyptian slavery 3,000 years ago. They were just liberated from their own slavery in modern times, under Nazi Germany. During the Passover service, the chaplain Plykov was moved by the presence of what he saw in his congregation there, not just American soldiers, but the folks who were in concentration camps who had survived and who were there in pitiful condition. Many of whom actually, when we were trying to take them back afterwards, several died on the way. We didn't have a chance to do anything except let them do what they begged to have done, to be there at the Passover service.
6 weeks after the Rhine crossings, the Soviets were masters of Berlin, and Hitler was dead. 8 days later, on the 8th of May 1945, the war in Europe ended, following the unconditional surrender of Germany.
Ich bin besiegt worden. Ich bin besiegt worden und das hat vielleicht so ein Jahr bis 1,5 Jahre gedauert, bis dass eben auch alle Sachen rauskamen, die passiert sind, Holocaust und so weiter. Und dann kam dann der totale Umbruch, also auch in der Meinung, wie verkehrt das alles war und wie schlimm das alles war. Ne? Aber erst habe ich mich nicht befreit gefühlt. Ich nicht. Viele mit Sicherheit, aber ich nicht.
It was a great anticlimax. It was like a drug. You were on a high of fairly controlled excitement. And my God, it was exciting. And then suddenly it stopped. Germans all quit.
For the young men who'd risked life and limb, it would soon be time to leave their comrades and return home, taking memories and experiences that would stay with them forever.
When it was over, well, what now? Kind of a flat feeling. I'm going to miss the comradeship of all those guys, and how they got the job done, I don't know. But I'm very proud. To have served with those guys.
We knew each other better than most people know their own family, because we went through hardships together and we helped each other survive.
Der Krieg ist zu Ende. Wir haben es überlebt. Das war die Grundstimmung. Also, wenn ich überlege, dann kamen am 11. März die Amerikaner hier nach Leubsdorf. Das war die Grundstimmung. Der Krieg ist zu Ende, Gott sei Dank. Die ganze Debatte, sind wir besiegt worden? Sind wir befreit worden? Für diese Gedanken hatte man erst Zeit, als alles vorbei war.
I opened the front door because my mother always left the front door open. And I walked in, I said, "Hi, Mom." And she blew up. She just, I was home. That's my story.
There was one of my sisters that was on the front porch, and she saw me top that rise and recognized me immediately. And she let out a scream, and I can hear all the way back in Virginia even now that Harley's home.
Getting off that train, and all these people were cheering and hollering and clapping and so glad to see me. I didn't know half, I knew a lot of them, but and my mother was crying, and I think I was crying.
I knew how short life was, and to live through something like that shows you that life is important.
Now that I've been in it and through it for 5 years and 3 months, I'm happy that the Lord let me live through this.